Music, the inverted induction of pain, is the psychological manipulation of someone's empathic response by turning pain into guilt, making them feel responsible for pain that does not belong to them. Inverted induction of pain. This technique consists of taking an emotional wound, real or invented, and strategically placing it at the feet of another person. The manipulator does not beg for compassion. Instead, he expresses a silent suffering, a subtle disappointment, or a deep sadness in a way that implies that the other person has caused it. It is not what he says directly. It is the sigh at the right moment, silence when comfort is expected, the look that lasts a second longer than normal. The victim begins to replay the situation in his mind, trying to figure out what he has missed, what he has done wrong, or how he has become the villain in another person's tragedy. And once guilt is installed, the dynamic changes. The one who feels guilty becomes anxious to repair, to earn forgiveness, to alleviate pain that never really belonged to him. This is how the trap is set. The manipulator now has silent power, not through aggression, but through emotional gravity. They do not demand obedience. They extract it through suffering that feels contagious. The victim begins to walk on eggshells, to overcompensate, to agree more, to ask less, to lock himself within himself. This technique is devastating because it does not look like manipulation. It looks like pain. And decent people rush to relieve pain. But when pain is reversed and becomes a weapon, it does not seek healing. It seeks control. The more the victim tries to fix things, the more entangled he becomes in an emotional debt he never had. Over time, they feel smaller, weaker, more insecure about their moral standing. And that is exactly what the manipulator wants. That they feel guilty, obedient, and emotionally controlled. Fragmentation of identity. The fragmentation of identity is the psychological act of subtly breaking a person's sense of self into conflicting parts and then activating those fractures able to destabilize their confidence, memory, or behavior. In essence, this manipulation consists of planting small contradictory signs that make someone question who they are. A manipulator can praise one version of the person while silently criticizing another. He will say to him, "I love when you are like this, so calm. You are not like when you are with others." Or, "Lately you are very responsible, not like before." These phrases do not seem harmful at first, but they begin to divide the image that the person who hears them has of himself, creating cracks between his traits, his past, and his actions. The victim begins to wonder which version is the real one. Is it the reliable person or the unstable one? Is it authentic when alone or only when it is being observed? These questions slowly erode the cohesion of identity, turning the inner world into a battlefield of contradictions. And that is the goal, to weaken the certainty a person has of himself so that it is easier to manipulate, easier to deceive, easier to control. When someone's identity is fragmented, it only takes a few well-placed signs to push them into shame, insecurity, or confusion. A single phrase can shatter their confidence. A look of disappointment can trigger the guilt of a version of themselves that they thought they had overcome. And a memory of which they were once proud may suddenly seem false if framed in the wrong way. This creates a state of psychological vertigo in which the victim cannot trust his own instincts, his history, or his reactions. He turns to the manipulator to tell him who he is. And that is the ultimate fracture. The moment in which he externalizes his identity in exchange for temporary certainty. Implanting silence. Implanting silence is a covert psychological technique that consists of training someone to suppress their voice, their desires, or their opinions, not by force, but by associating their expression with tension, disapproval, or rejection. It starts subtly. A small frown when he speaks, a delayed response after he has opened up, a change of energy when he asks for something. The manipulator does not argue, nor shout. In its place, it uses silence as a weapon wrapped in velvet, soft enough to deny, sharp enough to feel. Over time, the victim starts to notice a pattern. Every time she tells the truth, even gently, the room changes. The heat fades, the closeness dies, She unconsciously learns that silence is safer than honesty. In the end, she begins to censor themselves, not because they have been told, but because that is how they were taught. They leave thoughts unexpressed, emotions buried, questions unasked. They believe they are being considerate or keeping the peace, but what is really happening is psychological silencing. Her voice becomes something they avoid at all costs. They are afraid of making things worse, afraid of being abandoned, afraid of that cold pause that they cannot explain but always feel. The genius and cruelty of implanting silence is that it leaves no scars. There is no fight to point to, no rule that has been broken. The manipulator can say, "I never told you to shut up," and she would be right. But she never had to. The silence spoke for her. The discomfort taught the lesson. The absence of affirmation became its own control. That is why so many victims of this tactic do not even know that they have been manipulated. They just think they are too emotional, too needy, too much. They confuse repression with maturity. But, in reality, their silence was implanted silently, constantly, and completely by someone who knew how to disappear at the perfect moment. Reality loop. The reality loop is a dark psychological technique that traps a person in a mental labyrinth in which any attempt to question, understand, or escape only leads to greater confusion, doubt, and dependence. The manipulator does not lie outright. She distorts reality enough so that the truth seems unreliable. She says things like, "That is not what happened," or "You are remembering it wrong," or "You are thinking too much again." And she often says it calmly, confidently, and with just the right emotional weight to make the victim doubt. Over time, the victim begins to distrust her own memory, instincts, and feelings. They check everything twice. They apologize for things they have not done. They begin to narrate their reality through the voice of another. But the loop does not stop there. When the victim begins to question the manipulator, she is met with denial, defensiveness, or guilt. "Why are you always so dramatic?" "I never said that." "You always turn things around." Each confrontation becomes another loop, because regardless of where the victim goes, the story changes. The facts are rearranged. The ground under their feet moves. And so, they go around and around trying to find where everything went wrong. In the end, they stop trying. The loop becomes their home. They live in constant doubt, not knowing what is real or imaginary, what is theirs or what they have been instilled with. The manipulator becomes the anchor, the only person who seems sure of everything. And thus, the victim clings to him, not out of love, but out of desperation to find something that gives them stability. Even if that something is precisely what makes the loop spin, the loop of reality is not just confusion. It is control disguised as truth. It strips a person of their ability to trust their own mind. And when that trust disappears, obedience often follows. The victim stops resisting, not because they agree, but because they no longer believe they are capable of knowing what is real. Poisoning by praise. Poisoning by praise is the psychological act of wrapping control, insecurity, or manipulation in praise so that what seems like validation gradually becomes a leash. It begins with admiration that seems too perfect. "You are so strong. I don't know how you put up with me. You're not like those selfish people out there. No one else could endure what I put you through." They are not just compliments. They are traps disguised as flattery because in each sentence a script is hidden, a role that is assigned to the victim. They're not only praised for what they are conditioned to remain that way. Silent, indulgent, overwhelmed, but smiling. The victim internalizes these praises without realizing that they are coded as expectations. Now, if they set a limit, they are no longer patient. If they express themselves, they are not understanding. If they leave, they are not loyal. The same words that once made them feel seen now shame them and force them to remain silent. It is no longer about being appreciated. It is about preventing that praise from being withdrawn. The genius of poisoning by praise is that it does not seem like manipulation. It seems like love. It seems like someone finally sees your best parts. But what they are really doing is turning those parts into a weapon, taking your goodness hostage. If the victim begins to break, to show anger or break the image, the manipulator reacts with disappointment, confusion, or subtle guilt. I thought you were better than this. So the victim obeys. An impossible level is demanded, not for their self-esteem, but to maintain the illusion that has earned them praise. They begin to fear their own truth, because leaving the pedestal means falling into guilt, isolation, or rejection. And thus, praise becomes pressure, compliments become chains, and the admired person gradually forgets who they were before they were told who they should be. Reverse guilt trigger. The reverse guilt trigger is a dark psychological technique that consists of making someone feel guilty for not doing something wrong. It turns the emotional script around, turning innocence into a burden and forcing the target to apologize, submit, or overcompensate, even when they have done nothing. At the heart of this trick is emotional reversal. Instead of accusing someone of direct harm, the manipulator expresses pain, disappointment, or rejection in response to behavior that is actually normal, healthy, or even kind. The victim is left confused, anxious, and struggling to fix things. Despite having no logical reason to feel guilty, a person might say, "I just thought you would care enough to stay longer," or "I guess I expected too much from you after you set a limit, said no," or simply made a decision for yourself. Suddenly, the focus is no longer on your right to choose, but on the pain that, according to them, your choice has caused. The mind reacts violently to this type of accusation. Most people are programmed to avoid guilt, seek peace, and repair damage. But when reverse guilt is activated, they are repairing a crime they have not committed. And in doing so, they begin to relinquish control, offering more than they should and doubting their own judgment. Over time, this dynamic becomes a cage. The victim begins to adjust their actions preventatively to avoid this inverted guilt. She shrinks, overdoes it, pleases others, and abandons herself only to avoid emotional manipulation disguised as a sadness or passive disappointment. The abuser does not have to raise his voice. He only has to sigh, look hurt, or walk away silently. The most dangerous thing is that it seems like empathy, but it is not empathy. It is emotional blackmail disguised as vulnerability. And it is one of the most effective control tools ever devised. Framing the dissonance of values. Framing the dissonance of values is the psychological manipulation of someone's moral compass by placing their values in direct conflict, forcing impossible choices, generating confusion, and gaining silent control. The manipulator does not attack your beliefs. He turns them into a weapon. He uses your own principles against you, turning loyalty into guilt, kindness into weakness, and honesty into conflict. He says things like, "I thought you believed in second chances," or "I guess compassion only matters when it suits you," or "If you really cared, you would understand why I did it." And so, the values that once made someone feel strong now make them feel conflicted and ashamed. What makes this technique so dangerous is its precision. The manipulator knows what the person he is targeting cares about. He knows what moral values sustain him. Then they begin to create situations, emotional traps, in which no action seems right. If the victim defends herself, she feels cruel. If she stays silent, she feels complicit. If she leaves, she feels like she is abandoning someone. If she stays, she feels like she is betraying herself. This type of mental warfare creates cognitive chaos. The person begins to question not only their decisions, but also their character. Am I really good? Am I really fair? Am I just a selfish person in disguise? The internal conflict makes them easier to influence because people trapped in doubt do not defend themselves. They try to fix things. They try to prove their worth. They try to be better. Over time, the manipulator does not have to control the person directly. The victim begins to control herself, misrepresenting her values to adapt to impossible circumstances. And there is the trap. The more they try to live according to their morals, the more manipulated she becomes because it is someone else who chooses the battlefield and rigs all the fights. Sowing cognitive hallucinations. Sowing cognitive hallucinations is the psychological trick of introducing subtle false details into someone's perception of reality until their own mind begins to fill in the rest. It is not about convincing someone of a lie. It is about making their brain believe that they themselves invented the lie. This trick does not use direct affirmations. It uses suggestion, innuendo, and silence. The manipulator could say, "Are you sure it was like that?" Or, "How curious. It seemed to me that she looked scared when you spoke to her." These phrases do not accuse. They do not even lie openly, but they infect the mental timeline of the target. They destabilize memory, perception, and certainty. A person who is sure of what he saw, did, or felt suddenly begins to question himself. He begins to rehearse alternative versions of reality. His own brain starts to hallucinate possibilities. And once the seed is planted, mind takes over. It fills in the gaps, rewrites the details, exaggerates the doubts. This is where hallucination becomes a reality. The person begins to feel that something is not right, even when it is. He becomes insecure if he caused damage, misinterpreted someone, overlooked a signal, or behaved inappropriately. It is a silent war inside his skull, and he does not even know who started it. This trick is terrifying because the victim begins to manipulate himself. He no longer trusts his own senses. He checks every memory twice. He starts asking others to confirm things he previously knew for sure. Over time, his identity erodes. His confidence disintegrates. They become dependent on the manipulator to perceive reality. It doesn't take much, just a whisper of doubt at the right time. This is how someone is made to hallucinate betrayals, guilt, or dangers that never existed. And once they do, it is not necessary to control them. Their own mind will do the work for you. Conditioning by withdrawal of trust. Conditioning by withdrawal of trust is the psychological act of offering deep emotional security and then subtly withdrawing it when the target shows autonomy, disagreement, or limits. It creates a dependence on approval by training someone to fear emotional disconnection as punishment. It starts with warmth. The manipulator builds a sanctuary of trust, affection, loyalty, listening, and encouragement. It makes the other person feel truly seen, often for the first time. This connection feels strange, intoxicating. But then, without warning, it disappears. Not completely, just enough to be noticeable. A change of tone, a cold silence, a shift in how the manipulator responds. It is not a confrontation. It is absence. And that absence says more than any insult. The victim feels that something is wrong. He mentally replays the last conversation. Was it when he dared to speak? When he doubted? When he asked for space? Does the manipulator neither confirm nor deny? He simply lets the other person squirm in uncertainty. The message becomes clear. The security you felt is conditional. It can disappear if you step out of line. And so the conditioning begins. The target starts to adapt. He silences the discomfort. He accepts things that he previously questioned. He stops asking for too much. He begins to embody the version of himself that keeps the connection intact. Not because they are weak, but because the loss of trust is unbearable for them. It is like emotional starvation after a feast. Over time, the manipulator no longer needs to withdraw. The threat suffices. For fear of encountering coldness, the victim controls her emotions. She lives with the quiet fear of error. Because when trust is a weapon, love is a trap. Each act of independence carries a risk of abandonment. And thus, the manipulator controls not only the relationship, but who the victim believes she can be. Emotional exhaustion. Echo. Emotional exhaustion. The echo is the psychological trick of reflecting someone's pain, stress, or vulnerability in such a way that it amplifies their emotional exhaustion rather than alleviating it. Imitating empathy on the surface, but underneath, it multiplies fatigue, disorientation, and emotional collapse. This tactic is used by those feigning care while draining energy. Instead of offering support, comfort, or clarity, they repeat the intensity of someone's suffering, but with the right distortion to make that person feel worse. If someone says, "I feel overwhelmed," the manipulator responds, Yes, it's like everything is falling apart, isn't it? Instead of helping anchor the other person, he sinks with her. It reflects despair, fear, and chaos, not to connect, but to deepen the abyss. The genius of this trick is that it seems shared. It seems like empathy, but offers no clarity or relief. It slowly suffocates, and the victim, exhausted, associates the conversation with tiredness. She begins to censor her emotions in the presence of the manipulator. Not because they hide, but because it costs too much. Emotional wear becomes unbearable. Over time, this dynamic becomes a subtle domination. The manipulator trains the victim to avoid expressing her needs or anguish. Because every time she does, the weight grows heavier, the emotions darker, and the silence more deafening. And so, the victim carries everything alone. Not because she wants, but because that is how she's taught. Vulnerability leads to more pain. The echo of emotional exhaustion is a weapon disguised as presence. It offers no solution, only reflection. And that reflection slowly poisons the soul. The more a person opens up, the more they drown in their own feelings, which come back to them with more force, heavier and more desperate than before. Technique of intimacy collapse. The technique of intimacy collapse is the dark psychological strategy of rushing into deep emotional closeness and then suddenly withdrawing, creating an emotional whiplash that makes the target addicted to reconnecting with a bond that has been abruptly snatched away from them. It starts like a dream. The manipulator reflects your thoughts, pain, past. He asks the right questions, tells the right jokes, and returns your deepest values as if he were your soul made in disguise. Intimacy feels immediate, as if you had known them forever. Vulnerability flows easily. Secrets are shared quickly. Emotional barriers fall, and it doesn't feel rushed. It feels predestined. But then, as suddenly as it began, it stops. The message is slow. The warmth fades. The emotional connection, what made you feel alive, disappears. You wonder what changed. Was it something you said? Were you too much? Have they lost interest? The manipulator offers no clear answers, only contradictory signals. One moment they are cold, and the next they offer a spark of the old warmth, enough to keep hope alive. This is the collapse, not of intimacy, but of your internal balance. You opened up completely, and then they left you spinning in the void. The human mind does not handle this very well. It craves closure, explanation, and coherence. So the victim begins pursuing the euphoria of that initial connection. They send more messages, they try harder, they give more of themselves, hoping to regain the closeness they once felt was real. But it was never truly real. It was designed simply to create dependence. The manipulator knows that once someone feels a deep connection, losing it hurts like withdrawal symptoms. It creates emotional hunger, self-doubt, and even obsession. And that is the true goal. It is not love, but control through their absence. Because when intimacy is used as bait, the victim doesn't fall in love. He falls into a cycle instead, one in which the manipulator decides when the connection lives and dies. Perception. Anchoring. The anchoring of perception is the psychological trick of subtly controlling how someone sees everything that follows by carefully manipulating the first impression that is formed. It does not force one to believe. It frames things. And once that framework is established, the human brain distorts reality to fit. The trick begins with an anchor, a vivid, emotional, or biased piece of data that is placed at the beginning of a conversation, decision, or interaction. It could be a silent warning, like sometimes she can be very dramatic, or a casual compliment like, "He is the smartest guy I know." These small statements seem harmless, but they become mental weights now. They distort every future detail through the prism of what was initially said. And it works because our brain is lazy. Once anchored, the mind stops seeing things clearly. Instead, it starts comparing things. If someone is told, "This guy is a genius," they are more likely to overlook his mistakes and exaggerate intelligence. If someone is told, "She is unstable," they will interpret confidence as arrogance and emotion as instability. The anchor becomes a filter. Everything else is adapted to fit it. What makes the anchoring of perception so dark is its invisibility. The manipulator never has to argue much. He just plants the anchor, steps back, and lets time do the distorting. The target believes he is objective, but he's not. He's trapped inside a lens he never chose himself, one silently handed to him before he started looking. And once that frame hardens, breaking it is almost impossible. New evidence gets discarded. Doubts are perceived as a betrayal. The person does not realize they are being controlled because the control occurred before any decision. He is not reacting to truth. He is reacting to that anchor. And that simple change can alter the way you see a person, memory, choice, or your entire life. The invisible trap of comparison now. The invisible comparison trap is a covert psychological manipulation in which someone is silently compared to an undefined, idealized standard, making them feel inadequate, anxious, and eternally insufficient without ever knowing who or what they are competing with. It does not start with criticisms. It starts with subtle praises, but not for you. The manipulator may casually mention that some people handle stress better, or that my ex never cared about things, or I greatly admire people who know how to stay calm. No names, no direct accusations, just a shadow projected on the moment. A reminder that someone, somewhere, does it better. And the target starts to shrink. As they do not know whom they are being compared to, they cannot fight it. There is no clear rival, nor defined defect. Only the sensation that they have fallen short now. The silence becomes a mirror now. And in that mirror, the victim starts to adapt. She becomes more pleasant, more restrained, more self-critical now. Not because she has been asked, but because she was evaluated and found deficient. This tactic creates a state of permanent emotional tension. The victim starts to feel that she is never enough, that she is always missing something invisible. Every compliment she receives, she perceives as conditional. Every mistake, she feels as a confirmation. She does not only want to be loved. They want to be better than whoever the manipulator is silently comparing them to. The genius of the invisible comparison trap is that it makes the target compete against a ghost now. There is no one to face, nor exact words to refer to, only the persistent sensation that someone else, somewhere, is easier to love now. And when people feel that they are being subtly eclipsed, they do not rebel now. They work harder to please now. They beg for approval and little by little disappear into someone else's standards. Delayed validation. Addiction. Delayed validation. Addiction is the psychological trick of making someone crave approval by denying it long enough to create emotional dependence. It is not about praise. It is about the moment when it is given and about doing it well. It does not only control what someone feels. It controls when one feels good about themselves. This tactic works by giving small, unpredictable doses of validation, praise, affection, and attention only after the person has exhausted themselves trying to earn them. The manipulator can remain distant, cold, or indifferent for days or weeks. Then, just when the target is on the verge of emotional exhaustion, they throw a single compliment at her. The truth is that you have done quite well this time. Or that is what they were waiting for. It seems like a great advance, but it is not really. It is a bait, and the brain chases it because the mind is programmed to look for patterns. This inconsistency becomes addictive now. The person starts to link their self-esteem to the hope of being noticed. She works harder, becomes more obedient, sacrifices her limits, and emotionally overextends herself only to receive the next dose of delayed approval. And when it finally arrives, it feels like love now. It feels deserved, but in reality, it was manipulated. This creates a toxic emotional economy now. The target is motivated less by truth or passion and more by the unpredictable reactions of the manipulator. Their sense of value starts to deteriorate. They stop trusting their own instincts. They need to see themselves through the other person's eyes. And those eyes only open when they have been broken enough. The terrible thing is that once someone gets hooked on late validation, they will defend their abuser. They will justify the wait, idealize the struggle, and even call it growth. Because In their mind, the moment praise arrives, it feels like healing, even though it has been the cause of the wound all along. Confusion by micro-apologies. The confusion of micro-apologies is a psychological tactic in which the manipulator offers superficial and frequent apologies, not to take responsibility, but to blur guilt, reset the tension, and maintain control through emotional disorientation. At first, the apologies seem sincere. "I'm sorry if you took it the wrong way. I'm sorry you feel that way. It was not my intention. I am sorry." But they are never direct, never complete, and never based on real responsibility. Instead of "I was wrong," the apology becomes an act, an emotional fog that silences the victim's anger while keeping the manipulator in control. The genius of the micro-apology is that it stops confrontation without resolving it. The moment someone starts talking or setting limits, the manipulator introduces a soft, vague "I'm sorry" into the conversation, and suddenly the mood changes. The victim feels guilty for insisting. They question whether their feelings are valid. After all, they receive an apology, didn't they? But something still does not feel right. That is the confusion. The brain seeks closure but does not find it. The apology did not include any change, recognition, or modification in behavior. It only served to neutralize the moment and gain more emotional space. And since the manipulator apologizes often, just enough to seem thoughtful, the victim begins to question themselves. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Over time, this creates a cycle in which the victim represses pain in exchange for superficial peace. They stop bringing up the subject. They lose track of what was real and what had been apologized for. And the manipulator never has to change because every wound is blurred by a soft and strategic "I'm sorry." Not too loud as to seem manipulative. Not deep enough to be real. Just enough to restart the game and keep playing. Hope collapse maneuver. The hope collapse maneuver is a dark psychological trick that uses optimism as a weapon, feeding someone enough hope to invest emotionally, only to snatch it away at the precise moment when it matters most. It is not about denying hope completely. It is about building it as a promise and then destroying it as punishment. This manipulation begins with a flash, an opening, a change, a sign that things could finally improve. A cold person suddenly acts warmly. A cruel boss offers a compliment. An emotionally distant couple begins planning a future. The victim begins to relax. They breathe for the first time in weeks. They believe that maybe, just maybe, they were wrong about everything. That maybe the pain had a purpose. That maybe the person really cared all along. And then, right at the peak of emotion, the rug is pulled out, the warmth disappears, the plans are canceled, the silence returns, the kindness evaporates, and it is not only the loss that shatters them. It is the moment in which the loss occurs. Because now they not only feel hurt, but silly for having waited, ashamed for having believed, exposed for having wished. This trick works because human spirit is based on hope. People can endure almost anything if they believe it takes them somewhere. Manipulators know it and exploit this. By offering temporary hope, they not only gain control, they restart the emotional level. The victim will try even harder next time. She will wait longer. She will forgive faster. All because once she tasted what he or she believed was change. Over time, the hope collapse maneuver creates a psychological scar. The person begins to distrust joy. She prepares for the worst when happy. She sabotages himself/herself before something good can come, because a part of her keeps waiting to fall. And that fear, that hesitation, that constant retreat from love, praise, or peace is a maneuver that continues working long after the damage is already done. Shame investment projection. The reverse projection of shame is a dark psychological tactic in which a manipulator takes the guilt or shame that she should feel and silently transfers it to the person she has hurt, making him/her carry the emotional weight of the abuser's behavior. It does not happen through screams or rage. It happens through subtle twists in logic, emotional reactions that do not fit the facts, and a masterful ability to play injured. Imagine that you are facing someone who has clearly crossed a line, lied to you, betrayed you, or neglected you. Instead of acknowledging it, she remains silent, sighs, seems disappointed, or says something like, "I can't believe you think I would do that to you." Suddenly, you're no longer the injured one. You are the aggressor. You are the one who has gone too far. You are the reason why they are now upset. This reverses the dynamic of emotional power instantly. The victim begins to back down, try to explain, clarify, soften her tone. She may even apologize for bringing it up, and the person who should bear the burden of shame now sees how her target carries it instead. This change is deliberate, even if it seems passive. The manipulator has become the victim of her own wrongdoing. She does not defend himself, slash herself from the accusation. She dissolves it by becoming the person hurt by it. Over time, the real victim begins to fear bringing up any issue that may create tension. They associate confrontation with guilt, emotional distance, or being labeled unfair or cruel. They are emotionally conditioned to protect the person who has harmed them, to carry a shame that has never belonged to them, to bury their truth for the sake of peace. And there is the trap. Shame is not erased. It is externalized. And the person who should have learned, changed, or atoned leaves relieved, while her victim leaves wondering why she still feels guilty. Retain anticipation. Retaining anticipation is the psychological trick of deliberately creating emotion, desire, or emotional accumulation in someone only to deny them the climax or delay the reward until their need becomes an obsession. It is to slowly strangle satisfaction, not through denial, but through postponement. And that weight, that hunger, that emotional pain that gnaws at you is precisely the goal. This tactic plays with the brain's reward circuit. When a person is promised something, attention, praise, closure, intimacy, their mind begins to anticipate it. That anticipation releases dopamine. It sharpens concentration, deepens emotional investment, and intensifies longing. But when the reward never comes, or continues to be postponed until it is out of reach, an emotional torment masked as patience is created. The manipulator may hint at a conversation that never takes place, offer an opportunity that never comes, or promise emotional vulnerability that she never shows. We'll talk later. I will explain it to you shortly. I just need some time. These phrases aren't lies. They are tools. Tools used to keep the other person in emotional suspense. Always searching, always waiting. And in that wait, identity starts to bend. The victim stops asking for what she needs. She begins to adjust her entire emotional rhythm to another's clock. She begins to chase the silence, to decipher contradictory signals, and to long for even the slightest sign of attention, because at least that means something will happen. But nothing ever does happen, and that is what makes anticipation so devastating. The person begins to feel that the lack of resolution is their fault. She tries harder, gives more, clings more. Meanwhile, the manipulator controls the relationship's rhythm, not with actions, but with absence. This type of control doesn't scream. It does not slam doors. It whispers, disappears, delays, and watches how the other person crumbles to pieces, still clinging to the hope that perhaps next time the promise will finally be kept. Hyperspecific psychological manipulation. Hyperspecific psychological manipulation is a refined form of psychological manipulation in which the abuser does not deny the entire truth, only the smallest and most precise details, which causes the victim to question not only her memory, but her perception of reality. Unlike traditional gaslighting, which often involves general denials, such as "that never happened," this method is very precise. The manipulator agrees with the general story, but denies exact moments, specific words, or the exact tone used. "Yes, I said that, but not in that tone." Or, "Of course, we had that conversation, but it was on Tuesday, not Wednesday." These corrections seem small, insignificant, almost reasonable, but precisely for that reason they are so devastating. Because when someone is told that they are wrong in the most insignificant part of an experience, they begin to doubt the entire event. Memory is fragile. When even a single detail is confidently questioned, the brain begins to reconstruct everything around it. The victim begins to wonder if she was wrong about what happened that day, Was I wrong about what he said? If I exaggerated the tone, did I also exaggerate the meaning? That doubt accumulates, and little by little, they begin to cede control of the truth to the person who questions it most convincingly. Hyperspecific gaslighting is especially dangerous because it seems intelligent, calm, and objective. It does not seem like abuse. It seems like someone is being reasonable while you get emotional. It is a tactic that leaves no obvious traces, only a subtle erosion of trust, clarity, and self-confidence. Over time, the victim becomes afraid of her own memory. She hesitates before speaking, rethinks things before defending herself, and begins to seek the manipulator's version of reality as the most stable. Not because it is true, but because hers has been worn down with small microscopic corrections. Emotional cutoff. Emotional cutoff is the psychological trick of abruptly breaking the invisible ties that make someone feel seen, valued, or emotionally safe just after they have opened up. It is the silent surgical destruction of trust, and it leaves the victim emotionally hanging, questioning not only the relationship, but her own worth. This tactic takes advantage of the natural vulnerability that comes with sharing emotions. The manipulator listens just enough to make the other person feel safe. He may ask intimate questions, hold his gaze, maintain eye contact, nod with gentle concern, all signs that he can be trusted. But once the deepest emotions, pain, shame, trauma, joy, are exposed, that is when the axe falls. A derogatory comment, a change of subject, a cold look, a mocking laugh, or even worse, a total silence. The sudden change is shocking. It creates an emotional whiplash that a brain cannot process. The person who felt welcome now feels rejected. And it is not just rejection. They feel exposed. They regret having opened up. They review every word. They wonder if they are too much, too dramatic, or broken. The manipulator doesn't have to say anything cruel. He only has to disappear when the connection is most needed. Over time, cutting the emotional thread trains victims to self-censor, to never go too deep, never feel so much, to keep their inner world locked behind a door that none can touch. Not because they want to, but because they learned what happens when trying. They fear the silence after vulnerability more than loneliness itself. And that is the true damage. The person stops trusting relationships. She smiles instead of talking. She nods instead of crying. And inside, she carries invisible wounds. Not from insults, but by the silent abandonment after the moment when he or she was finally authentic. Altruism as weapon. Altruism as a weapon is the psychological manipulation of goodness, where acts of generosity, support, or selflessness are used not to help, but to control, force, or shame the target until it submits. The manipulator does not shout, but gives. She sacrifices himself/herself. She appears at the right moment with help, comfort, or solutions. But there is a silent price sewn into each favor. It is unsaid. It is felt. After all I've done for you, I left everything to be there. I always put you first. These phrases sound noble and humble. But the moment you set limits, say no, or express discomfort, generosity turns against you like a dagger wrapped in grace. That is the weapon. Guilt disguised as love. The victim begins to feel that he or she owes something. She does not want to seem ungrateful. She does not want to hurt someone who has always been kind. So she stays silent. She adapts. She pays invisible debts. She adapts to a version of himself/herself that will not offend the person who has given him her so much. But deep down, he or she feels trapped in a contract that he or she never accepted, in which each act of independence feels like a betrayal. This tactic is especially cruel because it uses virtue as leash. The manipulator puts on a martyr's mask while moving the threads behind the curtain. It creates a reality where kindness becomes coercion and saying no feels like sin. Over time, the victim begins to equate love with debt, help with guilt, and support with submission. She does not feel free. She feels observed, judged, tied by the invisible threads of generosity. And worst of all, when he or she finally tries to express himself/herself, he or she meets disbelief. But she has been so good to you because no one sees a cage when it is made of flowers. Micro-framing contagion. The micro-framing contagion is a psychological trick that subtly infects someone's vision of the world through small, repeated changes in how things are described, until their entire perception of reality is distorted without them realizing it. It is not based on lies. It is based on the distortion of language, repeated so often that the victim begins to see the world through a lens they have not chosen. This tactic works like a slow drip of poison. The manipulator does not argue, demand, or attack. Instead, he reframes neutral or positive events with slight changes in wording, tone, or emphasis. You trust people too much becomes you are too naive. She is ambitious becomes she's desperate for attention. That opportunity sounds exciting becomes it sounds risky. Honestly, none of this sounds aggressive. But the emotional framing is distorted, and that distortion spreads over time. The target absorbs the new frame without resistance because it is never direct. It goes unnoticed by critical thinking, and therein lies the genius of microframing. It looks like a conversation, not control. But soon the person starts repeating the language. He begins to doubt the people who give him security. He hesitates before celebrating joy. They become suspicious, cautious, cynical, without remembering when that change began. It is contagious because it spreads not only from the manipulator to the target, but from the target to the world. Once infected with a distorted frame, the victim unconsciously spreads it to others through tone, hesitation, or subtle disapproval. It becomes the air he breathes. He does not realize that his optimism has been replaced by suspicion, his confidence by paranoia. And the worst thing of all is that they often think that these new beliefs are their own. The contagion of microframing does not scream. It whispers. It infects through casual comments, repeated tones, and cunning emotional biases until the victim sees reality not as it is, but as the manipulator wants it to be. And when they realize, they're already transmitting the virus out loud. Feedback deprivation technique. The feedback deprivation technique is a subtle psychological strategy in which a person withholds emotional responses, approval, validation, praise, or even criticism to create anxiety, doubt, and obsessive behavior in the target. At first, it feels like confusion. You make an effort, you say something meaningful, you open up, or you do something kind. And there is no reaction, no recognition, no warmth, just a lost look, a slow nod, a change of subject. The manipulator does not argue. He stars you. He deprives you of answers, leaving you to fill the silence with questions. Have I done something wrong? Was it not enough? Should I try harder next time? You start chasing a reaction that never comes. This is the trick. Most people are psychologically programmed to seek feedback. We crave it to understand where we are socially, emotionally, and relationally. When that feedback is lacking, the mind enters a spiral of uncertainty. And uncertainty is a powerful form of control. The manipulator does not need to criticize you. He simply makes you feel invisible, and that absence begins to burn. Victims of this technique often begin to over-explain, overcorrect, and overcompensate. They try harder to please, to impress, to earn some kind of sign that they matter. But the more they give, the quieter the manipulator gets. Emotional deprivation deepens their obsession. Not only does it make the victim feel insecure, but it also makes them desperate to get any kind of reaction, even if negative. At least that way, they know they exist. Over time, the manipulator becomes a judge of value itself. Their silence decides what has real value. And the victim, once confident, becomes a shell, constantly adapting, anxiously scanning, never feeling entirely safe. All because someone learned how to punish. Not with cruelty, but with a cold absence of feedback. The sudden injection of distance. The sudden injection of distance is a psychological trick of abruptly moving away from someone emotionally, mentally, or physically after a moment of closeness, causing confusion, insecurity, and a deep need to reestablish the lost connection. It's not a breakup. It's a shockwave designed to destabilize. This tactic works because the human nervous system responds to connection as safety. When someone opens up, shares laughter, feels warmth, or experiences intimacy, their brain will release oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin. These chemicals say, "Here, you are safe. You are loved," but when that connection is torn away suddenly, without warning, explanation, or closure, the mind panics. It looks for what has gone wrong, what has been said, and what needs fixing. And in that panic, control is shifted. The manipulator does not explain this silence. He does not respond quite as quickly. His gaze grows colder. He stops laughing at their jokes. Or even worse, they act completely normal, but colder. That contrast is what truly destroys. The person who previously felt seen now feels unseen. Emotional euphoria turns into emotional withdrawal, and the victim blames themselves. This creates an addiction to restoration of it. The victim begins chasing the connection they briefly had, doing everything to recover it. She becomes more compliant, apologetic, and desperate. And with every effort she makes, the manipulator regains power, not by giving affection, but controlling its absence. The sudden injection of distance is often used in toxic relationships, narcissistic abuse, and traumatic bonds. It trains the victim to associate love with fear, safety with instability, and closeness with dread. The brain begins preparing for distance the moment it feels connection, and that fracture becomes quite permanent. A part of them never fully trusts intimacy again, not even when it is real, because the warmth now carries the shadow of the next wave of cold. Affection denied as a punishment. Affection denied as punishment is a tactic of psychological control in which love, warmth, and intimacy are strategically withdrawn, not for emotional reasons, but as a consequence for behavior that the manipulator wants suppressed. It is not a loud rejection. It is silent and calculated. One day, they are affectionate, committed, and present. The next day, you feel them moving away, not physically, but rather emotionally. Eye contact begins to fade. Laughter simply disappears. Messages become shortened now. Physical contact becomes less frequent now. You try getting closer, but they subtly move away. And they don't explain why to you. That is what makes this tactic work. They simply act in a disappointed, tired, or worried way. They leave you guessing what you have done wrong. This creates a dangerous loop. The victim begins to rewind each conversation, each tone, each choice. She begins to internalize the belief that love is conditional. If she speaks too much, too little, if she disagrees, expresses her needs, or simply acts outside the manipulator's comfort zone, she risks receiving emotional coldness. Affection is no longer a sign of love. It becomes a reward, something to be earned, something not to be spoiled. Over time, the person receiving the treatment becomes hyper-aware of their behavior. She lowers her voice. She hides her irritation. She learns which version of herself is worthy of being loved and which one makes the atmosphere cool down. And she begins to choose emotional security over authenticity. That is the key. Affection becomes currency. The manipulator knows that the threat of emotional distance is more effective than any argument, because when someone has tasted real closeness, its sudden absence hurts like rejection. And when that absence is linked to punishment, the victim not only feels unloved, but feels unworthy. So she obeys, not because she wants to, but because the silence of someone who once loved you can be as suffocating as if they had raised their voice at you. Hijacking the personal narrative. The hijacking of the personal narrative is the psychological trick of slowly rewriting someone's life story in real time, subtly replacing their own memories, meanings, and beliefs with another person's version. It does not require force. It requires suggestion. And once it begins, the victim begins to forget who she is and begins to become who the manipulator says she is. This technique works by intercepting key moments in a person's autonomy, memories of strength, choices of independence, or painful experiences. The manipulator does not deny these things openly. He reinterprets them. You were not brave. You were reckless. That was not abuse. You just misinterpreted it. You have always needed someone to guide you. These are not true statements. They are injections designed to nullify identity. At first, the target resists, but over time, with repetition, emotional pressure, and isolation, she begins to question her own perspective. She begins to rewrite past events through the manipulator's lens. Suddenly, moments of courage become mistakes. The boundaries she was once proud of now seem selfish to her, and the parts of her story that once gave her strength now embarrass her. The more the narrative is hijacked, the weaker the original identity becomes. The person stops defending herself, not out of submission, but because she really begins to forget what was real. She adopts the language of her abuser. She explains her trauma using someone else's script. Someone else's script. They apologize for who they were before the hijacking began. And the ingenious cruelty of this trick is that the victim often thanks the manipulator because it seems like clarity, guidance, truth to her. But in reality, she has been separated from the deepest part of herself until her voice is no longer her own. And all that remains is a life story written by someone who never loved her, who only wanted to own her. Sabotage of subjective reality. The sabotage of subjective reality is the psychological tactic of dismantling someone's trust in their own perceptions, not through outright denial, but by subtly rewriting their experiences until nothing they feel, see, or remember seems solid to them anymore. It starts quietly. It describes how something made you feel, and they respond, "That is not what happened." Or, "You are too sensitive." You mention a pattern that you observed, and they call it a coincidence. You remember a moment of tension, and they say that it was not so serious. They're not discussing your story directly. They're slowly editing it word for word, tone by tone, until you wonder if you ever understood it. The sabotage does not occur through open conflict. It occurs through calm and safe redirection. They paint your instincts as defective, your memories as exaggerated, your interpretations as emotional or overstated. And as they do it so subtly, so rationally, you doubt yourself long before you doubt them. You find yourself questioning feelings that seemed clear before. You hesitate to share your thoughts, fearing being wrong again. You begin to ask others, to review events, to write a diary, to try to grasp the truth as if it were smoke between your hands. And, nevertheless, it continues to escape you because every time you reconstruct a version of reality that makes sense, they gently dislodge a piece. Over time, this erosion becomes a threat to your identity. You no longer trust your instincts. You do not know what really happened. And in moments of fear or clarity, you even wonder if you're the problem. That is the real danger. When a manipulator no longer needs to lie, they have trained your mind to do it for them. The sabotage of subjective reality turns truth into a puzzle without pieces. It traps you in a world in which every feeling is questioned, every thought is reformulated, and every version of your own story ends with a question mark instead of a period. Subtle undermining undermines subtle success. Undermining is the psychological trick of downplaying, diverting, or misrepresenting someone's achievements enough to erode their confidence without provoking an open conflict. It is not about blatant sabotage. It is about corroding pride from within until success feels empty, undeserved, or even shameful. This tactic thrives in close relationships where praise should be safe. Family, partners, friends, even coworkers. When someone shares good news, such as "I've been promoted, my project has gone viral," or "I finally finished the book," the saboteur does not attack directly. Instead, they launch micro-darts masked as casual comments. "Wow, how good. You must have been lucky." Or, "I did not think that mattered to you." Or just wait for the real pressure to begin. They are not insults, they are infections. Each one introduces doubt. The person begins to wonder, was it really important? Did I deserve it? Am I being arrogant for celebrating? And little by little, pride becomes personal questioning. Motivation becomes overcompensation. Joy becomes a need for external permission to feel good. What makes this tactic so dark is its subtlety. The manipulator puts on a mask of support while exhausting the energy behind each achievement. They rarely say anything directly wrong, but they never fully celebrate. They never reflect the enthusiasm, their silence, their tone, their choice of words. All of this brings the achievement back to reality enough to overshadow its brilliance. And over time, the victim becomes allergic to their own success. They minimize their victories. They apologize for their growth. They share less, dream less, and wait for others to validate what once made them feel proud. Because at some point they were taught, your light shines too brightly. And now they dim automatically before someone does it for them. Framing guilt during sleep and wakefulness. Framing guilt in sleep and wakefulness is the psychological manipulation of a person's natural rhythms, using their patterns of rest, fatigue, and daily energy cycles to subtly instill guilt, shame, laziness, or emotional inferiority for the simple fact of being human. It doesn't sound cruel. It sounds productive. You're still in bed. It must be nice to sleep in. Some of us are already on our third task today. It's not about direct attacks. They are casual, fleeting comments that sink in like small cuts. The person to whom they are addressed may have needed rest. Perhaps they were recovering, working late, or simply existing. But suddenly, resting becomes something to apologize for. They feel slow, weak, behind. Even when their body is fine, their mind starts panicking. And it doesn't end when the day begins. Guilt for sleeping extends to a person's entire rhythm. If they are not early risers, they are lazy. If they slow down at night, they are wasting time. If they take a nap, they are avoiding responsibilities. The manipulator links productivity, virtue, and even love to a schedule that fits their own expectations. Using time as a moral weapon, the victim begins to restructure their habits, not to adapt to their well-being, but to regain an invisible approval. Rest is earned, never granted. Sleeping becomes a shame. Over time, this tactic not only affects the routine, but poisons identity. The person begins to feel like a failure before having breakfast. They wake up with anxiety. They overcompensate to exhaustion. They try to deserve peace, and when they rest, they feel like it has been stolen. This is how manipulation works. It's not about sleep. It's about control over energy, rhythm, and self-confidence. And when someone feels bad for simply existing at the rhythm of their own body, they become easier to handle, easier to exhaust, and easier to control. Because exhaustion not only breaks the body, it also silences will. Jealousy. The insinuations. Jealousy. The insinuations are the psychological trick of creating the illusion that another person poses a threat. Not accusing, but subtly insinuating until the victim becomes paranoid, insecure, and emotionally unstable without understanding why. It's not about infidelity or betrayal. It's about instability through imagination. This tactic does not require lies, only whispers, pauses, and well-aimed glances. The manipulator can casually mention a name in conversation. Oh, I ran into Maya today. She was very pretty. Or leave a phone notification visible long enough to arouse curiosity. They may laugh too much at someone else's joke in front of their partner or compare them to someone else under the guise of compliment. You are much more sensible than Jenna. Each of these moments is surgical. They do not make direct accusations. They provoke insecurity. The victim begins to repeat the words and analyze the gestures, wondering about past, future relationships, and phantom rivals that perhaps do not even exist. It corrodes their peace, not with truth, but possibility. They start asking questions never asked before. They navigate social networks differently. They dress carefully, speak sweetly. They try harder because a shadow has been planted where trust was before. And the genius of this trick is that it makes the victim feel jealousy. They start hating their reactions. They apologize for being crazy. They feel guilty for asking questions, and in the end, they stop expressing discomfort because the manipulator continues to seem calm, honest, indifferent. Over time, the victim begins to fight an invisible enemy. It is not a person, but possibility. She no longer knows what is real. All she knows is that something is not right. Something feels threatened, and little by little it is crumbling, while the manipulator remains on the sidelines, innocent, watching her collapse in a war that she never declared. Inversion of emotional reward. The inversion of the emotional reward is the psychological tactic of inverting the natural emotional consequences of behavior, so that healthy actions are punished and those that involve sacrifice or harm are rewarded with affection, praise, or closeness. This technique reprograms a person's emotional compass. When they defend themselves, set limits, or express a need, they are met with coldness, criticism, or rejection. But when they shut up, tolerate abuse, overdo it, or abandon their own needs, the manipulator showers them with affection. Suddenly, love feels safer when self disappears. At first, the trap is invisible. The victim does not realize the pattern until her nervous system does. Every time she tries to be honest or strong, her body feels punished through emotional distance, tension, or guilt. But when she abandons herself, something strange happens. The room gets warmer. The silence is broken. The tension softens. Love returns. And that is the inversion. The natural consequences of empowerment are reversed. Telling the truth no longer brings connection. It brings pain, and giving up your needs no longer brings loneliness. It brings comfort. The emotional logic of the relationship is reversed until the victim begins to equate the annulment of herself with security. Over time, they stop looking for what is good for them because they've been taught that it hurts. They only pursue what makes the relationship feel stable, even if that kills their spirit. The manipulator does not need to say a word. Their reactions train the other person like a machine, punishing authenticity and rewarding obedience. This is how the inversion of the emotional reward works. It hijacks the feedback loop of love. And once the person believes that betraying themselves is the only way to be accepted, they will continue to give themselves little by little just to feel close to the one who taught them that pain is love. Denial bombing. Denial bombing is the psychological trick of overwhelming someone with a rapid and repeated avalanche of denials so aggressive, so sure, and so emotionally intense that they make the truth itself collapse under pressure. It is not just about denying something, but about detonating disbelief in the mind of the person who is trying to cling to reality. This tactic works by brutally forcing confusion into the victim's nervous system. If someone confronts a manipulator with evidence, "You said that, you did this, I saw it," the manipulator does not explain, justify, or defend himself. Goes on the offensive. "That never happened. I never said that. You're making it up. You always do the same. What's wrong with you?" The denials are quick, strong, relentless, and leave no time for the victim to process them. The human brain, under emotional shock, begins to short-circuit, especially when the person denying seems so sure. The victim begins to doubt what they know. They begin to wonder if they are misremembering, exaggerating, or being irrational. The force of the denials seems more real than the memory itself. What makes the barrage of denials so devastating is that it bypasses logic. It attacks the foundations of perception. When done repeatedly, it creates a split in the victim's sense of reality. They know what they felt, but are told that those feelings are false. They know what they saw, but they are told that their eyes lied. And finally, they stop trusting themselves completely. This is not just psychological manipulation, but psychological bombardment. The goal is not to persuade. It is to disorient, erase reality through emotional overload. And when the storm calms, the victim often apologizes. Not because they were wrong, but because they're shattered by a storm of denial that has made certainty seem like madness and truth a weapon against them. The doubt loop. The doubt loop is a tactic of psychological sabotage in which a manipulator repeatedly reflects uncertainty in the target until doubt becomes a mental reflex and confidence dies in the echo of their doubts. It starts with small interruptions. "Are you sure? I don't remember it that way. I think you may be misinterpreting things." These phrases don't sound cruel. In fact, they sound worried, even protective, but they sow small seeds of uncertainty. And the more they are repeated, the more doubt the target has before speaking, acting, or deciding. In the end, the victim internalizes the manipulator's voice, begins to anticipate it. Before making a decision, they ask themselves, "What if I'm wrong? What if I remember it wrong? What if I exaggerate?" is no longer necessary for the doubt to come from outside. It resonates from within. And the worst thing is that now they believe it is their own voice. They don't realize they have been installed. The echo gets louder over time. Every attempt to trust in themselves is followed by mental noise. Rehearses conversations before having them. Apologizes in advance. Checks and rechecks their memory, their feelings, their tone. Confidence becomes arrogance in their mind. Certainty becomes a burden. They begin to ask permission to exist. This loop is a slow suffocation because it does not kill certainty suddenly. It only delays it until it dies on its own. The victim is trapped in a mode of perpetual rehearsal, terrified of being wrong, desperate to obtain validation, exhausted by thinking in circles. And the manipulator, he doesn't even need to say much anymore. The loop does all the work for him. They built the cage, and now the mind itself is closing the door again and again, resonating with endless questions. Heat withdrawal spiral. The heat withdrawal spiral is a psychological trick of overwhelming someone with affection, attention, and emotional closeness. Then, slowly and silently, it is taken away until the absence becomes a punishment for which the victim blames themselves. It's not about being cold. It's about making the heat feel conditional, unpredictable, and addictive. At first, the manipulator seems all light. He reflects emotions, gives compliments, initiates deep conversations, responds quickly, and offers an intense presence. The victim feels chosen, safe. Her nervous system opens like a flower to the sun. And just when she begins to depend on that climate, the emotional heat begins to fade. But it doesn't disappear at once. That would be too obvious. Instead, the changes are subtle. The message is shortened. Eye contact weakens. Laughter becomes less frequent. Responses are delayed. Affection becomes scarce. But there are no fights or explanations, just a slow, suffocating cold. And in that cold, the victim begins looking for the cause. She repeats conversations, apologizes for imagined offenses, and tries to regain the heat by being kinder, quieter, and more pleasant. And that is exactly how control is established. The manipulator turns love into a game of acting. Be exactly how I want, or I walk away. Over time, the victim stops asking for their emotional needs to be met. They are afraid of altering anything. They fear that even a slight expression could provoke more distance. So they shut up, and with every step they take to keep the warmth alive, they lose a little more of their own inner fire. The spiral deepens when the manipulator shows warmth again from time to time, just enough to rekindle hope. A loving message, a kind gesture, a sudden hug. It seems like rescue, but it is actually the reset button of the spiral. And they fall again, confusing inconsistency with love and coldness with something they must have caused. Interruption of belonging. The interruption of belonging is a covert psychological tactic in which a manipulator destabilizes a person's sense of connection, inclusion, or community enough to make them feel like a stranger in spaces where they previously felt safe. It doesn't take much. A joke that isn't funny, a group conversation in which the victim is ignored, a subtle change in tone when she enters the room. The manipulator can say, "Everyone was wondering where you were," or "We've already talked about that," or "You wouldn't understand." These comments are superficial, but they hurt deeply, not because of what they say, but because of what they imply. You're late. You are different. You are not one of us. This tactic targets a primary human need, the need to belong. When that necessity is threatened, people do not rebel. They adapt. They shrink. They strive more to fit in. The victim can laugh at things that do not seem funny to them. He nods when he does not agree, offers help where it is not necessary, just to feel included again. But the feeling of disconnection persists. He does not shout, humming, and the manipulator controls the volume. They decide when the victim feels included and when not. One day they are warm and bring them closer to themselves. The next day they are cold and distant, making them doubt their place. Over time, this unpredictability restructures the victim's behavior. They become hyper-attentive to social cues, desperate for approval, terrified of exile. They do not feel part of something. They feel temporarily tolerated. That is the power of the interruption of belonging. It does not drive people away. It makes them cling more, not to the connection itself, but to the hope of it. Because when someone feels that they're always about to be enough, about to be accepted, about to be safe, they will continue contorting to get a seat at a table that was never built for them to rest. Superposition of desires. Exploitation. Superposition of desires. Exploitation is the psychological trick of identifying what someone deeply desires and then reflecting it enough to create the illusion of perfect alignment, only to use that superposition as a leash. It is not about giving someone what they want. It is about pretending that you also want it until they confuse manipulation with connection. This tactic begins with attentive listening. The manipulator does not dominate the first conversations. They extract. They find out what excites the other person. The dream, the value, the future they yearn for. It could be emotional intimacy, success, security, adventure, or belonging. Once identified, the manipulator echoes it. That is exactly what I have always wanted too. I feel the same. We are very similar. The words seem forged by destiny. The soulmate fades, and that is when the hook is set. The victim opens up. They project compatibility. They invest. They begin to imagine a shared life path. But little by little, the coincidence begins to change. The manipulator pushes the shared desire in their direction. If we really believe in this, shouldn't we go faster? If this is what we both want, why don't you try harder? They use the shared dream to demand conformity. The genius of this trick is that it is not perceived as pressure. It is perceived as alignment. The victim does not realize they are being pushed. She thinks that she is yielding for love, destiny, or a purpose. And when things do not go well, she blames herself. Am I not prepared? Am I sabotaging this? Am I the problem? Over time, the shared dream becomes a tool for emotional control. The manipulator gives just enough to keep the illusion alive while, in silence, directing everything for their benefit. And the victim stays, sacrifices, and submits because leaving would be like betraying not only a person, but the dream that she believed she had finally found. Tactics of sowing reputation. The tactics of sowing reputation are a form of social manipulation in which a person strategically plants subtle and credible comments or stories about someone with the aim not of completely destroying their image, but of slowly corroding the perception that others have of him. It never looks like a smear campaign. It seems like casual concern, light jokes, or comments in passing. The manipulator could say, Aoshi, I love her, but sometimes she could be a little intense. Or, she is brilliant, although a little unpredictable. Or, they have good intentions, but you know how they get when they get excited. These comments do not accuse, they suggest. And suggestion is much more powerful than accusation because it allows the listener to draw their own conclusions while the manipulator remains clean. This is how social narratives are planted. Not with force, but with seeds. Small enough to be ignored, but sticky enough to grow. When the same idea is repeated to different people in different ways, it begins to resonate in the social environment. Suddenly, others begin to notice what they have been prepared to notice. The victim's passion becomes excessive. Their confidence becomes arrogance. Their silence becomes coldness. And no one wonders where this framing comes from because it seems to have arisen organically. Meanwhile, the victim has no idea. She only begins to notice subtle changes in the way people respond. Fewer invitations, less eye contact, a feeling of distance that they cannot explain. And when she finally hears the rumors, it is already too late. The room has been dyed. Her name has been manipulated. And the people around her have absorbed a story without realizing that they have been told it. That is the genius of sowing reputation. It does not destroy in one fell swoop. It erodes with rumors. It turns the target into socially radioactive without seeming cruel. And when the victim realizes that her reputation no longer belongs to her, the manipulator is already 3 steps ahead, watching from a safe distance while everyone else does the job of isolating her. Extraction of hypervulnerability. The extraction of hypervulnerability is the psychological trick of getting someone to reveal their deepest wounds secrets, and traumas quickly, not to understand them, but to use them as a weapon later. It is intimacy as surveillance, compassion as camouflage. And once the information is extracted, it does not disappear. It waits. This tactic begins with a false sense of security. The manipulator creates a surge of emotional closeness, often within hours or days of meeting. He may say, "You can tell me anything," or "I've never felt so connected so quickly." They can even share a fabricated trauma to create the right environment, something raw enough to seem real, yet vague enough not to be traceable. The victim, trapped in the glow of an intense connection, feels safe opening up, and so she does. She talks about betrayals, guilt, and abandonment from her childhood. She confesses parts of herself that she rarely reveals. The shame, the insecurity, the hidden scars. And as they talk, the manipulator listens attentively, nodding gently, with perfect timing. It feels like they're listening to you. It feels like love. But what is really happening is a collection of data, intimate information disguised as emotional bonding. The danger does not appear immediately. It arrives later, when the relationship shifts, when control is needed, or when the victim resists. It is then that the wounds are repeated as a threat. Isn't it the same as when your father left? You're doing the same thing again. You always said you hated that about yourself. Don't behave like a victim. You also said that you used to manipulate people. Suddenly, the things that were shared in confidence are no longer sacred. They are tools. And the victim, realizing that her vulnerability has turned against her, often stays silent. Not by force, but from shame. Because now even her pain belongs to another. And that feeling of emotional violation can run deeper than any lie ever told. The trap of cognitive dissonance. The trap of cognitive dissonance is a psychological manipulation technique that forces someone to hold two opposing truths, one that she sees and another that they tell her, until the mental tension leads her to abandon her judgment. Not for clarity, but for relief. It starts with contradictions. A manipulator can hurt you and then insist that they love you. He lies to you and then says that he has always been sincere. He neglects you and disguises it as giving you space. Your body reacts, confused, tense, nervous. But when you question the incongruity, he doubles down on his conviction. "You're just misunderstanding me. Why would I do that if I didn't care about you? You always think the worst." Now you are trapped. Your mind cannot harbor both realities without fracturing. If you believe them, you must ignore your instincts. If you believe yourself, you must accept that someone you trust is manipulating you. Both options hurt. So the brain does what it is programmed to do in dissonance. It looks for the path that offers less resistance. And most people choose to believe the version that provides them with temporary emotional security, even if it costs them the truth. That is the genius and cruelty of the trap. The manipulator does not need to be coherent. He only needs to be convincing. And the more confusing the contradiction, the more the victim clings to the illusion that perhaps she is wrong. It starts rewriting memories so they match the narrative. It represses uncomfortable emotions. They defend the same behavior that hurts them because if they did not, everything would collapse. Over time, the victim becomes emotionally numb. Their inner compass spins wildly. They no longer trust what they feel, see, or perceive. The only thing they know is that they can no longer maintain both versions of reality. So they discard their own. And at that moment, the manipulator wins, not by dominating, but by making the truth too painful to bear. The use of empathy as a weapon. The use of empathy as a weapon is the psychological trick of using someone's compassion as a control tool, turning their kindness, patience, and understanding against them. It is not about evoking empathy. It is about exploiting it, turning it into a leash that keeps the victim silent, submissive, and emotionally trapped. This tactic begins when the manipulator identifies a person with a kind heart, someone who gives others the benefit of the doubt, who listens attentively, who sees the good in others even when it hurts. Then, the manipulator begins to misbehave, to lie, to withdraw, to lash out, or to break their promises. But when confronted, they do not deny anything. They collapse. They give explanations. They cry. They tell a tearful story. I'm having a very bad time right now. You know, it was not my intention. It is because of what I experienced as a child. Suddenly, the roles reverse. The victim, who had every right to set boundaries, now feels guilty for mentioning it. Their anger dissolves into pity. Their strength melts into sympathy. They say that nothing happens when something actually does. They forgive too quickly. They accept too much because their empathy makes them feel cruel for defending themselves. Over time, this dynamic trains the victim to repress their needs, to tread carefully, and to absorb damage without reacting. Every time they try to protect themselves, the manipulator becomes the injured party. And the more damage the victim suffers, the more responsible they feel for the pain of the person who hurts them. The horror of the instrumentalization of empathy is that it makes goodness seem dangerous. The same trait that once connected the victim with others becomes the reason why they remain in toxic patterns. And little by little they learn that love must always be accompanied by suffering, and that defending oneself means abandoning someone who needs them, even if that someone is the one who is destroying them. Programming of regret. The programming of regret is a tactic of psychological manipulation in which a person is conditioned to associate their independent decisions with pain, guilt, or imaginary loss. Thus, they begin to avoid actions directed toward themselves, not because they are wrong, but because they have been taught that they will haunt them later. It starts with a pattern. The manipulator does not prohibit the action. They simply link it to future suffering. Someday you will regret having said that. I hope you do not look back and realize that you ruined something good. I do not want you to make a mistake from which you will never recover. These statements seem worrying, but they offer no guidance. They offer a ghost, a shadow of future pain that the victim begins to fear long before anything has actually gone wrong. The target begins to doubt. It delays decisions. They suppress their instincts. They divert their choices through the question, what if I regret it? And in that hesitation, the manipulator gains power. Because each moment that the victim stops, doubts, or panics, she returns to the person who instilled the fear in the first place in search of security, permission, or control disguised as comfort. The genius of the programming of regret is that it requires no real punishment. The punishment is imaginary, internalized, self-inflicted. The manipulator simply builds a future that the victim learns to fear. Then he frames each act of self-affirmation as the first step toward that imaginary disaster. And when something goes wrong, however small it may be, the trap closes. You see? I told you this would happen. The person is not only hurt, she is humiliated by her own disobedience. And next time, she stays silent. She obeys not because she is weak, but because she has been programmed to see her will as something dangerous and the voice of another person as her only shield against regret. Engineering accidental intimacy. The engineering of accidental intimacy is the psychological trick of orchestrating emotionally intense moments that seem organic and spontaneous. Thus, the other person believes that a deep and authentic bond has been formed by destiny, not manipulation. It is the illusion of chemistry created through calculated chaos. This tactic begins with engineering situations that mimic vulnerability, urgency, or emotional openness. The manipulator may accidentally reveal something personal in conversation, let his voice crack at just the right moment, or create a moment of shared secret, such as, I've never told anyone this. These events are presented as spontaneous, but they are deliberate signals designed to convey emotional security and connection. Other times, circumstantial intensity is manufactured. A late-night call after a hard day. A walk that turns into an intimate chat under the stars. A sudden confession of fear or childhood pain. The environment is prepared so that it feels raw, fragile, and intimate, although none of it is really improvised. The victim interprets the emotional exposure as something exceptional and real and responds by opening up in turn. And that's when the trap closes. The connection seems unique, special, fleeting, like two souls colliding at the perfect moment. But in reality, the manipulator simply understands a fact. Human beings create bonds quickly under emotional pressure. Accelerated vulnerability feels like love, especially when mutual. But here it is not mutual. It is fabricated. Over time, the victim becomes emotionally attached, believing that she has found an exceptional connection. She overlooks the warning signs, justifies the inconsistencies, and idealizes the manipulator because she believes she has seen his true version. But what she saw was not reality. It was an act designed not to connect, but to capture. Victimhood, framework of superiority. The framework of superiority of victimhood is a dark psychological technique in which the manipulator presents his own suffering as something so unique, noble, or untouchable that it places him above responsibility, turning pain into a pedestal and vulnerability into a form of dominance. It doesn't sound like power, it sounds like pain. The manipulator talks about stories of betrayal, abandonment, and struggle. He cries easily. He reflects often. He says things like, "No one has gone through what I've gone through," or "You have no idea what it is like to live with this kind of pain." And little by little, the conversation deviates not toward healing, but toward hierarchy. Because his suffering is not only something he has endured, it is something that now belongs to him. In this framework, the victim becomes a moral authority. Their pain gives them right to interrupt, accuse, withdraw, and control. And if you try to set a limit or make them responsible, they call it cruelty. How can you say that to someone like me? You are turning this into something of yours. Again, the power is inverted. The more they hurt you, the more compassion you're expected to show them. And if you dare bring up your own pain, they minimize, dismiss, or compare it. At least you had a family. At least you didn't go through what I went through. Your suffering isn't real. It is disrespectful because, in their eyes, there is room for only one victim, and they have already claimed it. Over time, this creates a suffocating dynamic. You become the emotional caretaker of someone using fragility as armor. You repress your needs to avoid seeming selfish. You validate endlessly, hoping they will one day do the same. But they don't need it. They're too busy surviving, too busy winning the tacit competition of who suffers most. And that is the cruelty of victim superiority. It turns empathy into a one-way street and uses pain to dominate, not connect. The echo of guilt. The echo of guilt is a psychological trick, planting emotional mines that reproduce in someone's mind long after the manipulator has left. They make the victim punish themselves in silence through recurring thoughts of guilt, shame, and imaginary crimes. It's not about confrontation. It is about implanting doubt that resonates endlessly. This technique works by suggesting guilt instead of expressing it. The manipulator might say, "I know you didn't want to hurt me," or "It's okay. I'll be fine." As always, these words sound indulgent, but they're loaded with emotion. The tone, the moment, the sadness in their eyes, that is what transmits it. The target leaves thinking that everything is fine, but something doesn't fit, and that something begins to spin in their head. Later, sometimes hours, sometimes days, the seed germinates. The mind repeats the moment. Was I too harsh? Did I say something wrong? Are they suffering because of me? The manipulator doesn't have to say anything else. The victim becomes their own accuser. Write the apologies. Rewrite the story. He obsesses over what he could have done, even when he's done nothing at all. Over time, the echo of guilt breaks a person's emotional reflexes. He begins to feel guilty by default every time conflict arises. He hesitates to speak. He explains too much. He apologizes excessively. It becomes hypersensitive to emotional changes, looking to others for signs of the silent damage that it must have caused. The echo grows stronger with each relationship. What makes this insidious is that the manipulator never seems cruel. In fact, he seems sensitive, noble, even hurt. But they know just what they're doing. Create echoes. Echoes that live in the victim's mind as ghosts that whisper, "You should have done more, have said less, have been better." And, over time, the victim begins to believe that guilt is proof of love and that peace is something that she no longer deserves. Injection of ethical doubts. The injection of ethical doubts is a tactic of psychological control in which the manipulator raises subtle questions about the morality of the decisions of the victim, not to inspire integrity, but to create vacillation, shame, and a chronic fear of being a bad person. It is not presented as accusation. It arrives as a suggestion wrapped in softness, bathed in guilt. I am surprised that you agree with that. I would not think it right to do something like that. It is your decision. I only hope you have thought about consequences. These words do not tell you that you are wrong. They make you wonder if you are. And in that doubt, the seed is planted. This tactic aims at the conscience. It hijacks the part of the mind that wants to do good, be kind, act fairly. But instead of fostering strength, it creates paralysis. The victim begins to overanalyze everything. How she speaks, what she says, what she asks for, even how she takes care of herself. Each action becomes an ethical dilemma. Each limit is perceived as a possible betrayal. She begins to sacrifice what is right for her to prevent another person from seeing her as a bad person. The genius of the manipulator lies in their plausible denial. He has never told the victim that she is immoral. He simply raises the question, and, as the victim is already programmed to be empathetic or considerate, she bites every time. She gets caught in a loop of moral anxiety, constantly apologizing, giving explanations, or walking on eggshells. Over time, the victim begins to externalize her ethics. She not only questions her decisions, but also her character. Am I selfish? Am I cruel? Am I losing who I used to be? They begin to submit to the silent judgment of the manipulator, reshaping themselves not around truth, but around fear. Because ethical doubt does not scream, it whispers. And those whispers, once internalized, become a leash that wraps tightly around the kindest part of the person until their kindness becomes their prison. Grafting of obligations. The grafting of obligations is the psychological trick of silently attaching duties, debts, or unexpressed expectations to acts of kindness so that the other person begins to confuse care with contract. It turns generosity into currency and affection into influence. In appearance, it seems that it is being given, but deep down a hook is being thrown. This tactic begins with a favor, a gift, or an emotionally generous gesture. The manipulator may go out of his way to help, offer support, or make sacrifices that seem considerate and pure. I stayed up all night helping you. I paid for that. Do not worry. I have not told anyone what you told me. These things seem selfless, but they have hidden conditions. Conditions revealed only when it is time to collect. Later, when the victim tries to set limits, asks for space, or acts independently, the debt is suddenly invoked. After everything I have done for you. Wow, is that how you repay me? I guess it was too much to expect the same loyalty. Kindness becomes a currency. The emotional gift becomes a receipt. And the victim begins to feel like a criminal for simply wanting autonomy. What makes the graft of obligations so toxic is that it rewrites the meaning of generosity. The victim begins to question every act of kindness they receive. Was it real, or will it come back later with a price? They begin to overcompensate, giving more than they should, saying yes when they want to say no, apologizing when they're the ones being manipulated, not because they owe anything, but because the manipulator has made them feel that way. Over time, the victim loses the ability to distinguish genuine care from covert control. Every hug has a trap. Every favor seems like a trap. And the most terrifying thing is that they begin to instill guilt, watering the roots of a debt that they never agreed to. Subtle sabotage of memory. Subtle memory sabotage is a psychological manipulation tactic in which a person does not erase your memories. It distorts them enough so that you doubt your memory, question your instincts, and ultimately accept their version of reality instead of your own. It does not start with denial. It starts with modifications. It was not exactly like that. I never said it like that. You are remembering it wrong. Once again, these corrections are not explosive. They are gentle, persistent, and specific. The manipulator is not trying to make you forget the past. He's trying to rewrite it moment by moment in his favor, not shouting louder than your truth, but subtly sanding it, blurring its edges and softening the parts that make him look bad. It is psychological erosion. You remember being hurt, but they remind you how sensitive you were then. You remember that they disappeared, but they offer you proof that they sent you a text message once. You face a betrayal and they say, "I don't remember it like that, but if it is so important to you, I'm sorry." And now you not only doubt what happened, you doubt your right to be upset about it. Over time, you start adjusting your own stories even before you tell them. You omit details. You soften things. You anticipate the corrections. The moment a memory arises, a voice whispers to you, "Wait, did it really happen that way?" And soon you start trusting the person who sounds so sure, so calm, even if your body remembers something very different. This is how subtle memory sabotage works. It does not need to be noisy. It just has to be close enough to be believable. Because when the truth is distorted, instead of breaking, it becomes difficult to hold. And when memory no longer feels safe, the victim stops arguing, not because they are wrong, but because they are too exhausted to maintain a story that no one else will validate. The social proof. Undermining social proof. Undermining is the psychological trick of silently eroding someone's credibility and sympathy in the eyes of others. Not through direct attack, but by sowing subtle doubts that spread like smoke through a room. It is sabotage of reputation disguised as concern, humor, or passive observation. And when the target feels cold, he does not know where the current is coming from. This tactic exploits a basic human instinct. We look to others to measure value, trust, and belonging. The manipulator knows this and begins the sabotage with whispers. He can say, "She has good intentions, but sometimes she exaggerates." Or, "He is intelligent, but you know how he gets when he is under pressure." These statements are not insults. They are seeds. Seeds designed to divide perception enough so that people start to see things differently. From that moment, confirmation bias takes control. If the target raises his voice, there it is. If he does not meet a deadline, it is typical. If he takes a bold step, it is too much. The crowd begins to change, not because of something the target has done, but because of a lens they never knew had been handed to them behind their backs. What makes social proof so sinister is its invisibility. The manipulator seems neutral, even understanding. He is not attacking. He is only being sincere, concerned, or joking. Meanwhile, the target begins to notice that people move away, doubt him, and deny him their trust. And the worst of all is that they begin to adapt, to fix it without realizing that the damage has been done. This trick is often used by jealous partners, toxic friends, or insecure couples who fear being overshadowed. They do not want to destroy the target publicly. They want to weaken their echo, soften their voice, reduce their presence, make their power invisible, not silencing them directly, but changing the way others listen. Trigger of the ghost betrayal. Ghost betrayal is a psychological manipulation technique in which a person invents or exaggerates feelings of betrayal, not because they have been hurt, but to make someone feel guilty, insecure, and desperate to prove their loyalty to a wound that never existed. It begins with a change of tone, a sudden silence, a strange distance. The victim feels that something is wrong, but does not know what. When he asks, the manipulator can answer, "I did not expect you to act like that." Or, "I thought I was more important." Or, the most toxic of all, "It does not matter. It is not worth talking about it." That is the trigger. The tacit accusation that, somehow, somewhere, the victim has broken an invisible code. The betrayal is not named because it is not necessary. It exists in the suggestion. It thrives on ambiguity. The victim begins to replay his words, his tone, his timing, looking for the mistake. What have I said wrong? Have I forgotten something? Have I been inconsiderate? The manipulator remains ambiguous. And there lies his genius. Because what is not seen cannot be refuted. The victim begins to self-incriminate, apologizing not for his actions, but for the possibilities. And that is where control takes hold. Once the victim believes he has hurt someone, he becomes anxious to repair the damage. Explain more. Offer more. It demonstrates even more. She tries to recover a trust that never really was lost. Meanwhile, the manipulator observes how the dynamic inverts. Now, it is he who has been harmed, who deserves attention, who can establish new expectations silently and without resistance. The ghost betrayal does not manipulate facts. It manipulates feelings about the facts. It makes someone feel disloyal for existing in their own truth. And the more the victim bends to repair the betrayal, the more they get lost, until guilt becomes obedience and love becomes a test that they never stop trying to pass. Application of unspoken rules. The application of tacit rules is the psychological trick of creating invisible expectations that are never clearly expressed, but that are strictly punished when they are broken. It traps people in a game they never agreed to play, with rules they did not know existed and consequences that feel like emotional landmines. This tactic starts subtly. The manipulator establishes patterns. How often you should send text messages, how much attention you should pay, how you should speak, what you should avoid, what he/she expects without saying a word. They smile when you follow these silent scripts and withdraw, punish, or make you feel guilty when you don't. The correction is felt, not heard. A cold treatment, a change of tone, a passive-aggressive comment. The atmosphere changes, and you are expected to know why. The genius of this trick is plausible deniability. If you confront them, they say, "I never said that," or "You're drawing conclusions." And technically, they are right. They never said it, but you felt it, and now you live under their shadow. Over time, the victim becomes hyper-aware. She begins to analyze each action, each word, wondering what invisible rule he or she might break next. She walks on eggshells, apologizes for things she didn't know were wrong, and over-explains her decisions to avoid emotional consequences. They begin to censor themselves, not out of respect, but out of fear of violating something they cannot see. This trick conditions the victim to self-control. The rules are imposed on themselves, often more harshly than by the manipulator. And the worst thing is that they begin to believe they are the problem, that their confusion, their pain, their doubts mean they are too sensitive or difficult. But it is not like that. They are trapped in a structure of emotional control where silence is a weapon. And each tacit rule is another chain that wraps around their sense of identity, tightened by each punishment they never saw coming. Technique of unspoken disapproval. The technique of wordless disapproval is a nonverbal psychological weapon in which the manipulator expresses judgment, disappointment, or rejection without a word, forcing the victim to absorb the shame, adjust behavior, and seek approval through pure emotional guesswork. It is not what they say. It is the pause, the look, the change in body language, a simple raised eyebrow, a sigh, a look at the phone in the middle of a conversation, or a cold look when the victim laughs too loudly or speaks too freely. Without arguments, without explanations, only energy, heavy, cold, piercing, and that impacts more than words. Because when disapproval is silent, it is perceived as truth, as something too obvious to justify. The victim notices instantly. A knot forms in his/her stomach. Her tone changes. Her shoulders drop. She begins to scrutinize. What have I done? Have I spoken too much? Have I gone too far? The manipulator never confirms it. They leave the tension floating in the air like smoke, and the victim breathes it, drowning in the possibility of having failed some invisible test. This technique creates an environment in which the victim becomes their own emotional police officer. It begins to adjust preventively, laughing more quietly, speaking less, questioning its joy, hiding anger. It begins to walk on glass floors that have never been shown it. And what is worse, they begin to long for validation from the same person who denies it to them. Because silence can be stronger than cruelty. And when affection is linked to absence of disappointment, the victim does not pursue love. It pursues not being wrong. It lives to avoid that pause, that sigh, that look. And little by little, it disappears under the surface of who it really is, only to keep the environment stable. The manipulator does not need to control through conflict. He achieves it through silent judgment. Because once the victim fears silence, she will do anything to make the coldness disappear, even if that means becoming someone she no longer recognizes. Promises of future. Retention. Promises of future. Retention is the psychological trick of showing visions of an ideal future. Love, commitment, success, happiness close enough to keep someone interested, but never enough to fulfill them. It is not about building a future together. It is about using the idea of one as emotional bait. This tactic begins with bright visions and powerful language. One day, we will live together. I really see us building something. When things calm down, everything will be different. These promises do not sound manipulative. They sound hopeful. They feel like intimacy, like direction, like a plan, and that is why they work. The victim believes that she is walking towards something real. But time passes, and that future remains exactly where it was in the future. The manipulator always has a reason why now is not the right time. I just need to clarify a few things first. We're so close. Let's wait a little longer. You are everything I want. I just need space right now. And so the victim waits, not because she is weak, but because she believes that she has been shown enough to continue believing. Over time, the person begins to live not in reality, but in potential. She defends the manipulator before her friends, justifies the lack of progress, and tolerates emotional limbo. Because in her mind, she has already seen the end. She just has to wait a little longer. And therein lies the genius of denying future promises. It does not cause pain. It delays the resolution. It lengthens the term just enough to exhaust hope without breaking it. The victim cannot leave because she is very close. She cannot demand more because she understands it. So she remains trapped in the illusion of a tomorrow that never comes, sacrificing the present in exchange for a fantasy that she will never reach. Engineering of moral traps. The engineering of moral traps is a tactic of psychological manipulation in which a person designs dead-end situations using the victim's own values, which paralyzes her emotionally and makes any decision she makes seem like a betrayal of her integrity. It starts with a trap. The manipulator creates a situation around a moral ideal that the victim defends. Goodness, loyalty, forgiveness, sacrifice. Next, he creates a scenario in which there seems to be only one way to protect that ideal, but it costs the victim their limits, their voice, or their truth. For example, if you really cared, you would stay. Or, good people don't leave when things get difficult. Or, what understanding? The victim is presented with a false choice: protecting themselves and being selfish, or surrendering and remaining good. This trap does not force, it entangles. The genius of the moral trap is that it makes the victim betray themselves in the name of righteousness. They remain in toxic dynamics to demonstrate that they love. They tolerate abuse to maintain loyalty. They give when they are empty because guilt whispers to them it is the right thing to do. The manipulator never has to pressure them directly because the person's own identity becomes the weapon. Over time, the victim begins to resent the qualities they once prided themselves on. Kindness begins to seem like weakness. Forgiveness becomes a failure. Their values, which were once sources of strength, become cages designed not to elevate, but to bind. They walk through life trying to be good, but always feeling like they are losing because each act of protection seems like a betrayal and each act of self-respect seems like a sin. That is the cruelty of moral trap engineering. It doesn't just control behavior. It reconfigures the soul to believe that being safe, honest, or free makes you wrong. And once that belief has been implanted, the manipulator never needs to pressure again. Conscience will do the work for him. The loop of praise, criticism, and confusion. The loop of praise, criticism, and confusion is the psychological trick of alternating between admiration and subtle criticism so unpredictably that the victim becomes emotionally disoriented. They constantly pursue approval, terrified of disappointment and unable to know where they stand. It's not just about contradictory signals. It is emotional whiplash disguised as feedback. The tactic begins with praise, not just compliments, but deep validation. You are incredible. Nobody does it like you. I had never felt like this. These moments have a big impact. They open the heart. They generate trust. The victim begins to feel safe, perhaps even special. But then, often in the same breath, comes the twist. You are incredible when you're not so sensitive. Nobody does it like you, but sometimes you overthink things. I had never felt like this, but you have to work on your attitude. These criticisms are not direct enough to refute, but they are sharp enough to hurt. They come wrapped in flattery, so the victim does not know whether to feel flattered or hurt. They begin to analyze the tone, to read between lines, to apologize for things they do not fully understand. Each conversation becomes a puzzle. Each silence feels like a punishment. Each compliment feels like a trap for the fall. The genius of this loop is that it creates dependence. The victim begins to live for the next wave of praise and to work tirelessly to avoid the next stab of criticism. But as the cycle is unpredictable, they can never truly win. They become addicted to harmony, allergic to conflict, desperate to do it better the next time. And that desperation reconfigures their self-worth. They stop asking themselves, is it fair? And start asking, what have I done wrong? And with each cycle, they give up a little more power until even their confidence is accompanied by conditions they have not accepted. And love becomes a test. They're always about to fail. Emotional overload. Synchronization. Emotional overload. Synchronization is a tactic of psychological manipulation where the manipulator deliberately overwhelms the victim with intense emotions at carefully chosen moments so that they cannot think clearly, establish limits, or process the truth. It is not about rage or breakdowns. It is about when emotional chaos is unleashed. Just before a decision, after a confrontation, in the middle of an argument when you are finally winning. Suddenly, the manipulator cries, screams, hyperventilates, or retreats into silence and despair. The air changes. Logic dissolves. What was once a clear moment becomes a storm, and you are forced to abandon your position to manage the time. It is not about a loss of control. It is tactical chaos. The victim, who may have finally gathered courage to speak, set limits, or ask questions, is now emotionally disarmed. She is no longer able to finish her thought. She finds himself/herself in the role of comforter, mediator, or savior. The manipulator knows that flooding the moment with emotional noise will short-circuit rational thought. It creates urgency, guilt, and confusion. Thus, the victim abandons her truth to restore calm. Over time, this technique conditions the victim to fear emotional reactions. She stops bringing up issues, not because she does not care, but because she does not want to provoke another collapse. She chooses peace over truth, calm over clarity. And that is the goal. Emotional overload at the right time makes confrontation impossible. It uses vulnerability, acting, or crisis as weapons to paralyze the victim's power at the moment it threatens to surface. And then, once the storm passes, the manipulator never touches the subject again because she does not need to. The damage is already done. The conversation is over. Silence returns. And the victim is left again with the pieces of a truth that drowned before it could breathe. Injection of perceived superiority. The injection of perceived superiority is the psychological trick of subtly positioning oneself as wiser, more enlightened, or more evolved. Not through open arrogance, but through gentle corrections, faint praise, and implicit elevation until the other person begins to diminish himself/herself without realizing it. It starts little by little. A change of tone, a raised eyebrow, a silent itch, an interesting perspective. The manipulator rarely attacks ideas directly. She refines them. She offers better versions. She says things like, "It's a good start," or "I also thought that until I matured." The message is always clear. You're not wrong. You are simply beneath me. This tactic works because it does not look like criticism. It looks like mentorship, guidance, sophistication, and that is what makes it so dangerous because the victim often admires the person who does it. He interprets condescension as intelligence. He begins to defer, to agree, to move away from his own voice to learn. But what he is really learning is to submit. Over time, he stops sharing bold ideas. He questions his own knowledge. He seeks permission to feel intelligent. And, in private, he rehearses conversations in his head, wondering how to sound more on his level. The manipulator does not have to dominate the room. He only has to radiate the illusion that he is already above her. The injection of perceived superiority does not scream power. It whispers it. He plays the long game, training others to kneel slowly, voluntarily. And the most twisted thing is that the victim often believes that she has improved thanks to this dynamic, when in reality, she has only become quieter, smaller, and more obedient to a hierarchy that has been manufactured in silence. Microcontrol tethering. Microcontrol tethering is a tactic of psychological manipulation in which control is not imposed by rules or threats, but through a constant flow of small preferences, corrections, and apparently harmless requests that little by little tie the victim's behavior to the manipulator's emotional comfort. It doesn't look like control. It looks like affection. I like you to send me a message before going to bed. That shirt doesn't suit you, does it? It makes me feel better when you answer me quickly. Each request is small. Each suggestion is easy to accept. But as they accumulate, they form invisible threads. One wraps the victim's way of dressing, another the way of speaking, another the way of managing time, space, tone, and presence. None is serious enough to reject, but together they constrict. The genius of microcontrol is plausible denial. The manipulator can always say, "I never forced you." And he didn't. Not once. He simply preferred. He guided gently. And the victim, who wanted to please, adapted again and again until, suddenly, she stopped acting freely. She's playing a version of herself that does not disturb the balance. She stops doing what seems right to her and begins to do what seems safe to her. This type of control generates hyper-awareness. The victim begins to control herself before each action. Will this bother them? Will they walk away? Will I make them feel uncomfortable? It is easier to obey than to risk a subtle disappointment. They live in a state of silent tension, always calibrated, always adjusting. Over time, the victim forgets what it was like to simply be. She no longer trusts her instincts because they have all been slowly reprogrammed by dozens of small corrections that did not seem like control, but they were. And the manipulator never had to raise his voice because, when control is exercised in fragments, the leash is invisible, but it pulls anyway. Engineering time scarcity. The engineering of time scarcity is the psychological trick of making someone believe that access, attention, or emotional availability are scarce, precious, and easy to lose. Thus, they panic and submit, making hasty decisions, suppressing needs, and sacrificing limits just to keep the connection alive. It's not about being busy. It is about turning urgency into a weapon. This tactic starts with a feeling of fleeting presence. The manipulator is inconsistent. One moment he is here, the next he is far away. He can say, "I don't know how much longer I can continue like this," or "I don't have time for drama." Or they simply disappear for hours, days, or emotional cycles, only to return with charm, intensity, or coldness. The rhythm isn't random. It is calculated. The victim begins to believe, this moment is important. If I don't act now, I will lose everything. Over time, the person begins to unnaturally deform to keep the connection alive. They rush to respond. They downplay concerns. They say yes when they want to say no. They give more, ask for less, and reduce their needs to silence. All because they are terrified that, if they speak too loudly or take too long, the manipulator may disappear again. And the cruel genius of this trick is that it turns emotional scarcity into a motivator. The victim stops asking, "Is this healthy?" and starts to ask, "How can I keep him here?" They confuse inconsistency with high value. They equate emotional coldness with emotional sophistication and soon feel fortunate that he notices them. The engineering of time scarcity turns love into a deadline, intimacy into a clock that never stops. And when the victim realizes that they have been trained to beg for crumbs, they have already burned their own limits to meet someone in a room that should never have stayed open. Unconscious framing of conflict. The unconscious framing of conflicts is a tactic of psychological manipulation in which a person subtly places another in a position where each choice, reaction, or emotion is framed as proof of an internal conflict that causes the victim to doubt their motives, question their clarity, and question their own sanity. It begins with a silent challenge. The manipulator notices your passion and tells you. You seem to be in conflict. He observes your firmness and tells you. It is clear that you are overcompensating. You express calm, and they murmur. You have become so distant. Each expression, however serene or authentic it may be, is framed as a symptom, a reaction, a mask that covers a deeper problem that they claim they see, but you don't. The trap is disorienting because there is no specific accusation to refute, just a persistent feeling that you're broken in a way that you cannot define. You feel that you must demonstrate your peace, justify your decisions, explain your confidence, until everything begins to seem empty. The more you try to clarify, the more they nod like a therapist unraveling a buried trauma, and you begin to wonder, am I in denial? Is something wrong with me? I don't see it. That is the danger of framing unconscious conflicts. Use insinuation instead of accusation. And insinuations are much more destabilizing because they force the victim to look inward and rummage through their mind in search of rot that never existed. They create a fog of introspection that prevents action. You stop trusting your clarity because someone has suggested to you again and again that even your certainty is a sign of chaos. And little by little you begin to externalize the distrust in yourself toward the one who questioned it in the first place. Not because he offered you the truth, but because he taught you to see the conflict in your own calm and the dysfunction in your own strength. And once that lens is installed, all the mirrors in which you look at yourself begin to fracture. Projection of invisible standards. The projection of invisible standards is the psychological trick of silently expecting perfection, obedience, or hyperconsciousness without clearly establishing the rules, and then expressing disappointment when those tacit norms are not met. It is not about establishing expectations. It is about punishing someone for not reading your mind. This tactic is cruel because it imitates morality. The manipulator never raises his voice. He sighs. He remains silent. He seems injured. And when asked, he responds with phrases like, "I thought you knew it," or "It is not something that I should explain." The message is, not only have you not done the right thing, but you haven't intuited what was right. And at that moment, the victim not only feels bad, but feels defective. Over time, this erodes trust. The target begins to walk through life with invisible cables wrapped around their actions. He rehearses conversations in advance. He anticipates needs that have not been expressed. He apologizes just in case, because fear is not the punishment. It is disappointment. That slow and chilling withdrawal of approval that says you haven't measured up and, worse, you should have known. And yet, the bar is always changing. What was okay yesterday today causes damage. What was previously praised is now barely recognized. The expectations of the manipulators float like smoke, intangible, always implicit, never recognized. If they are pressured to name the bar, they hide behind vagueness. It's just common sense. Everyone knows you're being difficult. The result is a person who constantly self-censors, hypervigilant, and ashamed of needs they can't even name. He feels inadequate, not because he is failing, but because he has been taught that understanding another person's silence is the true test of his worth. And the more that silence intensifies, the more invisible he becomes within his own life. Activation of imposter syndrome. The activation of the imposter syndrome is a psychological manipulation tactic in which a person deliberately amplifies another's hidden insecurities, subtly fueling the fear that their success, intelligence, or value is false, fragile, or undeserved. It starts with compliments that hurt. "I'm impressed that they gave that role to someone so new. You're doing very well for someone without formal training. You have truly mastered the art of appearing confident." These statements seem supportive, but contain silent landmines. They don't question what you've done. They question if you have earned it. And that is what triggers it. The victim begins to doubt not only his achievements, but his entire identity. Every success seems like a fluke. Every compliment seems suspicious. Every mistake seems like an exposure. They begin to look over their shoulder emotionally, terrified that someone somewhere will finally say out loud what they secretly fear. You don't belong here. The manipulator doesn't need to push much. A raised eyebrow during your presentation. Slow applause when you share good news. A reminder of how lucky you are. These are the invisible needles that slowly inflate the feeling of fraud. And the more the victim achieves, the more pressure he feels to defend his worth instead of celebrating it. Over time, this tactic erodes trust from within. The victim becomes addicted to perfection, terrified of visibility, desperate to prove what he never had a question in the first place. And what's worse, he begins to shrink, reject opportunities, remain silent in meetings, avoid risk. Not because he lacks ability, but because someone taught him to see his strength as a mask. This is how the imposter syndrome is activated. Not by attacking your weakness, but by corrupting your brilliance. It doesn't tell you that you're worth nothing. It makes you whisper it to yourself, louder each time you get up. Micro-sabotage of joy. The micro-sabotage of joy is a psychological trick that subtly drains the life from someone's happiness. Not attacking them directly, but inserting small pricks into moments of emotion, pride, or celebration until they fear joy itself. It's not about making someone feel miserable. It's about making their joy feel insecure. The manipulator doesn't shout or mock. He sighs. He takes his time to respond. He responds to enthusiasm with cold indifference or, even worse, with sarcasm disguised as a joke. You're very proud of that. It must be great to have time for such things. Don't get your hopes too high. You may receive insincere praise, mixed with doubts. Good for you. We'll see if that lasts. And it works because it seems insignificant, harmless. The victim ignores it at first, but her nervous system does not. The euphoria she felt turns into unexpected disappointment. Laughter fades more quickly. The heart sinks more quickly. And soon her body begins to associate joy with disillusionment. They begin to attenuate their own shine preventively before someone else does it for them. Over time, they share less. They celebrate privately, hide their victories, minimize their passions, and stop talking about what excites them. Not because the dream has died, but because it is no longer safe to show oneself smiling. They fear the pain that follows a smile. Meanwhile, the manipulator maintains the illusion of normality. He never takes away joy directly. He just makes sure it never gets completed. He sows doubt in the celebration, the tiredness and the emotion, the distance and the closeness until happiness itself becomes confusing, heavy, dangerous, and, finally, the victim stops pursuing joy. Not because she doesn't want it, but because she has been taught in subtle and invisible ways that every time she touches it, she bleeds. Mirror of intellectual minimization. The mirror of intellectual minimization is a psychological manipulation tactic in which a person subtly reflects a distorted image of another's intelligence, minimizing their knowledge, ideas, or experience through faint praise or theatrical misunderstandings until the target begins to question their own mental acuity. It rarely sounds cruel. It sounds polite. You have a very creative, unconventional way of thinking. You always have interesting perspectives, even if they are a bit extravagant. You are intelligent in your own way. These aren't compliments. They are controlled reflections, mirrors distorted enough to sow doubt without directly offending. The manipulator reframes intellect not as a strength, but as a peculiarity, a novelty, a harmless eccentricity. The effect is subtle, but corrosive. The victim begins to soften her language. She prefaces her opinions, pausing before speaking. Her thoughts seem heavier to carry, not because she has become less intelligent, but because she has absorbed the belief that she is slightly out of sync, slightly off course. Every time she shares an idea, and it is received with a mocking smile, a vacant-eyed nod, or a delayed response, she feels smaller. The manipulator often positions himself as the realist, the rational or balanced voice, not demonstrating superiority, but carefully framing the victim's intellect as excessive, emotional, or disconnected consistently. And this framing works over time. The victim internalizes a restraint. She speaks, but not too boldly. She thinks, but not too differently. She knows, but always with apology. That is damage from the mirror of intellectual minimization. It does not silence genius. It dampens it. It trains brilliance to doubt itself until, finally, the mind that once illuminated rooms now flickers silently, hoping not to offend, not to stand out, not to seem too much in a world that smiled while slowly erasing its reflection. Strategic withdrawal of oneself. The strategic withdrawal of oneself is a psychological trick of eliminating your presence, attention, or emotional availability at carefully chosen moments. It is not to leave, but to make the other person fear losing you. It is not abandonment. It is emotional scarcity used as bargaining chip. And its power lies in the opportune moment, not absence. At first, the manipulator shows himself as he is. He gives warmth, interest, laughter, shares dreams, and has deep conversations. He makes himself feel indispensable. The victim begins to depend on his presence, not only for company, but also to regulate her emotions. And then, without warning, they walk away. A text message goes unanswered. A conversation becomes bland. Affection turns off. And the silence isn't random. It is strategic. The withdrawal lasts long enough to create panic, confusion, or self-pity. The victim replays the interactions, wondering what she said wrong, how she overdid it, or what flaw she revealed. And just when the fear reaches its peak, the manipulator returns, smiling, unperturbed, acting as if nothing happened. This intermittent disappearance becomes a form of control. The victim begins to control her tone, silence her needs, and act constantly, hoping to avoid the next disappearance. She tries harder to keep the connection alive, even when she feels it's slipping away, and internalizes a lie. The manipulator is the stable one. I am a problem. Over time, the manipulator's presence becomes a drug. Each return feels like a relief, a second chance, a lifeline. But it is not love, it is conditioning. The victim learns that emotional security is not something taken for granted. It is a reward for obedience. And every time the manipulator walks away, he leaves behind a stronger bond, until the victim does not fear being rejected, but being forgotten, erased by someone who once made her feel unforgettable. Expectation, collapse, ambush. Expectation, collapse, and ambush are a tactic of psychological manipulation in which someone gives you hope, creates expectation, or promises an emotional reward, and then suddenly withdraws it. Not for circumstantial reasons, but to provoke a controlled emotional collapse designed to leave you destabilized, grateful, or guilty. It starts with an upward rhythm. Plans are made, invitations launched, words of affirmation offered. The manipulator promises something he knows is important. Presence, affection, commitment, celebration. Watch how your eyes light up. He sees that you have emotionally committed. And then, at the peak of that expectation, he stabs you in the back. Not with cruelty, but with reasons. I don't feel like it. Something came up. You are exaggerating. It is not that much. The disappointment is made to seem small, reasonable, but the moment feels too perfect. The energy drop is too abrupt, impact too deep, because it was not about the event, but about emotional withdrawal. The shock that follows isn't accidental. It is planned. The victim, stunned by the unexpected turn, feels more than disappointed. She feels unworthy. They repeat everything in their head. Was I too excited, too needy, or expectant? They begin to question not only the situation, but themselves. And then the second wave arrives, guilt. They don't want to seem ungrateful. They repress their pain. They offer understanding. They comfort the same person who made them fall. This is the trap. Over time, the victim becomes reluctant to hope. She learns to attenuate her joy preventively, not to expect too much, to prepare for the fall that always seems to follow ascent. And that is the goal. Emotional conformity through learned caution. Because when someone fears that their happiness will be used against them, they begin to ask for less, to expect less, to want less, And the manipulator does not have to take control because they have already trained the heart not to aspire. It favors the anchoring of guilt. The anchoring of guilt is the psychological trick of doing apparently generous things for someone, not out of kindness, but to create a persistent feeling of debt so heavy that the victim begins to adjust their behavior to return something that was never freely given. Is not help. Is a contract disguised as care. The manipulator does not demand gratitude right away. He offers favors that seem considerate, even heroic. I stayed up all night helping you prepare. I left everything to be there. I covered you. Don't worry. The victim feels grateful, moved, but that is exactly what the manipulator wants to anchor guilt in the core of their relationship. Later, the favor reappears, not as a demand, but as a shadow. When the victim expresses a need, a discomfort, or even a limit, the manipulator subtly invokes the past. I guess it's easy to forget all I've done for you. Wow, I wouldn't have said no if you asked me. It's okay. I just thought we cared for each other. These phrases are soft, but they hurt. The victim is hit by a wave of guilt, not because she has done anything wrong, but because she is made to feel disloyal for not compensating enough. And so she yields. She overdoes it. She says yes when she wants to say no, not out of love, but out of obligation. What makes the anchoring of guilt for favors so insidious is that it corrupts generosity's meaning. The victim begins to question every act of kindness, wondering if it will take a toll later. And in the end, she stops asking for help because, deep down, she has learned a harsh truth. In this relationship, each gift feels like a leash. Each act of generosity carries a debt that they will never fully pay. Tactic of depriving curiosity. The tactic of depriving curiosity is a strategy of psychological manipulation in which a person hides key information, emotional context, or clarity, not to protect, but to create a void that keeps others constantly searching, guessing, and emotionally tied to the unpredictable drops of truth that the manipulator gives them. It does not start with silence. It starts with almost saying something important, almost opening up, almost clarifying. They offer just enough to awaken your interest, just enough to make you lean in, but never enough to keep you calm. They give vague hints. There's more to that story, but I don't want to go into details now. Or you would never believe what really happened. Or if you knew everything, you would see things differently. These statements aren't conversations. They are bait, and the victim bites. They ask follow-up questions. They inquire carefully. They wait, hoping that the next conversation will fill the gaps. But it never does. The manipulator diverts attention, changes topic, or gives a cryptic answer that generates even more questions. Over time, this creates psychological hunger. The victim not only wants information, they need it. Not because it is interesting, but because the retention has created a mental unease. They can't stop scratching. That is the trap. The manipulator becomes the only source of closure, of understanding, of truth, but never fulfills. It keeps the victim emotionally involved by making them feel almost aware of everything, but always a little on the sidelines. This hunger for information becomes emotional dependence. In the end, the victim finds herself trapped in a cycle of excessive thoughts, idealization, and even defense of the person who does not let her in. She begins to believe that the answers she craves are just one conversation away. But that conversation never comes because the power was not in the story, but in the hunger. And when someone controls the flow of truth, they don't need to lie to manipulate. You just need to keep you waiting. Programming of sudden absence. The programming of sudden absence is the psychological trick of disappearing abruptly, without prior notice or explanation, just after creating deep emotional intimacy, leaving the other person in a storm of confusion, longing, and doubts about herself. It's not just disappearing. It's about training the nervous system to crave instability. This tactic begins with intensity, frequent messages, long conversations, emotional vulnerability, shared secrets, flirting, or even declarations of love. The manipulator floods the target with connection, so much so that the target begins to reorganize its emotional rhythm around this new bond. Her day, her thoughts, her sense of security everything begins to revolve around the presence. That's when a manipulator cuts it off. Disappears. No messages, no explanations, no goodbyes, just silence. At first, the victim panics. What has happened? Have I done something wrong? Will she be okay? She goes over everything, looking for mistakes. She blames herself. And then, just when the anxiety becomes unbearable, the manipulator returns, carefree and serene. Sorry, I just needed some space. You're thinking too much. Don't give it so much importance. But it is important because something inside the victim has changed. The disappearance becomes a traumatic loop. From that moment, every moment of closeness comes accompanied by fear. They stop expressing their needs. They become complacent. They walk on emotional eggshells, terrified that the slightest misstep will cause another disappearance. And this is where the programming begins. The brain begins to associate affection with loss, security with unpredictability, love with fear. Over time, the victim not only tolerates instability, awaits it, pursues moments of euphoria more eagerly, shrinks during the low moments, clings more every time the manipulator returns. Because now the threat is not only rejection, it is the erasure, the complete disappearance of something that once felt real. And the fear of that emptiness becomes the chain that makes them return. Mirror of inverse empathy. The mirror of inverse empathy is a dark psychological tactic in which a manipulator inverts the script of emotional validation. It reflects your pain, not to connect with it, but to redirect attention to themselves. Thus, your suffering becomes an accessory of his. It starts when you open up. You are vulnerable, exposed, perhaps even trembling with emotion. And just when you finish speaking, they tell you something like, "I know exactly how you feel. When it happened to me, it was even worse." Or, "I understand it. It's like when I was also completely abandoned." At the beginning, it seems like empathy, but it is not. It is a kidnapping. Your pain has become a script. Your moment has been absorbed and reflected, twisted to fit into their narrative. This is not connection. It is emotional theft. The mirror of inverse empathy turns every wound you reveal into a mirror that they use to admire their own reflection. You end up consoling them in the middle of your crisis. You see how your story becomes the backdrop of theirs. You start to feel guilty for having mentioned it, for having triggered their emotions, for not being more sensitive to their pain. Over time, this dynamic teaches you a dangerous lesson. Your feelings only matter if they can serve someone else's. You start to doubt before opening up. You preface the pain with disclaimers. You reduce your needs because you know that in the end they will be eclipsed. And worst of all, you may start to believe that that is what empathy is. This is how the mirror of inverse empathy traps you. It does not silence your pain. It reflects it enough to make you believe that you have been heard before using it to build the throne of the manipulator. And when you realize that you have been emotionally inverted, you're already apologizing for your sadness, while the person who caused it is once again being consoled in your arms. Partial validation technique. The partial validation technique is the psychological trick of giving someone just enough approval to keep them emotionally involved while subtly denying them total affirmation, so that they're always striving, always insecure, and always need to earn the next drop of approval. It's not about encouragement. It's about keeping someone wanting. The manipulator never fully denies the victim's value. That would encourage resistance. Instead, they offer crumbs of praise. It's better than usual. You're getting there. Not bad. These phrases are designed to make you feel progress, but not culmination. Like hope, but not certainty. The validation is partial and incomplete. Thus, the target pursues the complete version that never comes. This creates a psychological cycle. The victim works harder, performs more, reduces their needs, and adapts to everything. Not because they are thriving, but because they are trying to prove they are enough. And every time they get close, the bar shifts. The praise is kept out of reach, and the manipulator maintains control. Over time, this dynamic changes the victim's relationship with success. Victories don't feel like victories. They feel like advances of an approval that has not fully arrived. They stop trusting their progress. They begin to ask for opinions before forming their own, to apologize for expressing pride, and to defer to the manipulator's judgment even when sure of themselves. The brilliance of partial validation is its subtlety. The manipulator seems understanding, even affectionate, but always holds back enough. Enough to keep the victim hungry. Enough to make them believe that, if they improve a little more, they will finally be worthy of praise. But the truth is that the goal does not exist because the game was never meant to end. It was only intended for control. Émotionnel leakage technique. The emotional leakage technique is a subtle tactic of psychological manipulation where a person expresses controlled fragments of emotion, frustration, sadness, or disappointment, just enough to change the atmosphere and make others feel responsible, guilty, or obligated to fix something never fully named. It is not direct. It is not dramatic. It is a sigh after conversation, the long pause before answering, the way they lower their tone when you mention something that excites you. They don't say what's going on. They don't need to. They hint at it, just enough for you to feel discomfort in your chest. Only the silence necessary for you to question yourself. You start analyzing the moment. Have I been too harsh? Have I said something wrong? Are they upset at me? The manipulator never clarifies anything. Let the unease linger. Let it envelop the room like fog. They may say it's nothing to forget it, or worse, say nothing. You wouldn't understand. Therein resides his genius. They transmit an emotion to you without information. Just enough so that you feel responsible, but never enough to allow resolution. Over time, this trains the victim to become hyper-attentive to every micro-expression, every pause, every subtle change. They live in emotional anticipation, constantly adjusting to avoid another leak. They apologize more, over-explain, try harder to smooth out the invisible tension, not because they know what they have done, but because they feel they must have done something wrong. This tactic creates a type of silent control. The manipulator does not have to demand, correct, or confront. He only has to feel a little uncomfortable, and the room adapts to him. Because when someone uses emotional discomfort like a scent trail, others follow, not out of love, but out of fear of having provoked it. Incomplete sentences. Incomplete sentences are a psychological trick that consists of intentionally leaving key ideas incomplete, planting suggestive and emotionally charged statements that force the other person to fill in the gaps with their own fears, guilt, or insecurities. It is not what is said that does damage. It is what is almost said. This tactic plays with the human brain's need to close things. When someone starts a sentence with emotional charge and then falls silent, a subconscious search for meaning is triggered. The manipulator could say, "It doesn't matter," or "I thought you would be different, but," or "I was going to say something, but I don't want to hurt you." These incomplete sentences do not directly accuse. Instead, they suggest something terrible just below the surface. And that suggestion is more powerful than any statement, because now the victim is doing the manipulator's work for him. Imagining the worst, questioning their own behavior, repeating everything they did or said. Have I failed them? Do I disgust them? What are they not saying? And in trying to solve the mystery, they become anxious, self-critical, and emotionally unstable. Over time, incomplete sentences become a form of psychological erosion. The victim begins to anticipate shame without it having been expressed. He begins to give excessive explanations, to apologize, and to question himself even before the conflict occurs, just to avoid the disturbing silence that says, "You have disappointed me, but I will not tell you how." What makes this tactic so destructive is its invisibility. The manipulator never has to take responsibility for a single cruel word. He keeps his hands clean while the victim drowns in their imaginary faults. And, in the end, silence becomes more powerful than words, because it teaches the victim that the most painful things are those that are half said. The trick of the ladder of expectations. The trick of the ladder of expectations is a manipulative psychological tactic in which someone gradually increases what they expect from you. It starts with small, reasonable requests and gradually increases them until you find yourself doing things you would never have accepted at first just to avoid conflict, guilt, or emotional consequences. It starts innocently. Can you help me with this quickly? Would you mind doing me that favor just this once? You say yes. Of course, yes. It's nothing. Then it happens again, but a little more demanding, a little less optional, a little more emotionally charged. I need you to take care of this for me. No one else will. I can't believe you're hesitating. You used to be so helpful. Little by little, the level of demand increases. You don't even realize that stairs are being built beneath you. And when you look down, you have already climbed far beyond your comfort zone. The trick works because it never takes too big a leap too fast. Each new request seems only a little greater than the previous one, just enough to keep your conscience busy and your sense of duty active. And if you resist, they bring out the initial kindness after all I have done for you. I didn't expect you to act like that. Now you're not only failing at a task, you are betraying an emotional agreement built on an invisible scaffolding. Over time, you stop checking your own limits. You only ask, what do they need now? You give more, you strive more, you swallow more, and the manipulator keeps climbing on you as if on a ladder, step by step, until you end up carrying all their emotional weight and wondering how you have become responsible for their comfort, their survival, and their state of mind. That is the cruelty of expectations ladder. It makes obedience feel like growth, submission like love, and exhaustion like loyalty, until you forget that you ever had the right to say no. Patterns of reopening wounds. Patterns of reopening wounds are the psychological trick of repeatedly returning to someone's past pain, not to heal it, but to keep it alive, making sure that the person remains emotionally weakened, easily influenced, and forever tied to the manipulator's control. It's not about support. It is about strategic re-injury. This tactic begins with trust. The manipulator invites you to reveal emotions, asks about past betrayals, traumas, insecurities, and love disappointments. The victim opens up believing that they listen to them, they see them, they understand them. And for a moment, that's how it is. The listener nods, empathizes, maybe even sheds a tear. But this vulnerability is not being preserved. It is being cataloged. Later, in carefully chosen moments during a conflict, a silence, or a negotiation, the manipulator resurrects the old wound. Not violently, but surgically. You're doing the same thing you did with your father. I understand it. You have always pushed people away when things got difficult. It's not your fault. You have been broken for a while. These phrases seem revealing, but they are weapons. Because the wound was not reopened to understand. It was reopened to control, to make the victim small again, to remind her of her pain, and that the manipulator can position himself as the only one who understands her and the only one who will stay. The victim, suddenly flooded by past emotions, becomes destabilized in the present. She questions herself. She returns. She apologizes not only for the moment, but for being who she is. Over time, the victim begins to anticipate the pain before it arrives. She self-censors, silences herself, shrinks because she has learned that any moment of disagreement, strength, or independence can trigger a memory of who she was when she was most broken. And in that loop, healing becomes impossible because every step forward is met with a knife made of the past. A wound that is never allowed to close. A scar that is endlessly reopened by the same hand that once said it cared. The delayed guilt loop. The delayed guilt loop is a psychological manipulation tactic in which guilt is not attributed in the heat of the moment, but hours, days, or even weeks later. Thus, the target receives an unexpected blow of guilt long after the event has passed, creating confusion, anxiety, and chronic emotional vigilance. It begins with silence. After a discussion, decision, or simple misunderstanding, the manipulator doesn't react. He smiles. He nods. He moves on. Perhaps he even says, "It's okay," or "Don't worry." He breathes, thinking the moment passed, but it is not. It has been stored. And then later, when you drop your guard, he brings it up, not with delicacy or curiosity, but with disappointment, resentment, accusation. "I didn't want to spoil things earlier, but what you said hurt me. I try to forget, but it's been eating at me. I can't believe you thought that was acceptable." Now he has caught you unaware. The moment feels confusing. You don't recall the exact details. You can't clearly defend yourself. And the worst is that you're caught off guard by the emotional weight they suddenly throw at you. You rush to remember your tone, words, and intention. You feel guilty, insecure, ashamed, and powerless. Because how do you fix something you barely remember doing? That is the pattern. The manipulator avoids conflict when you hold the emotional advantage. Then he returns once he has it. And since the moment is unexpected, it restructures your behavior. You start controlling every word, fearful of what may be okay today and punishable next week. You live in retroactive guilt, always preparing for emotional consequences that may or may not come. This tactic doesn't only make you feel guilty. It makes you feel haunted by past moments, forgotten expressions, neutral phrases that can become sins. And over time, you learn not to relax, speak freely, or trust peace. Because in the delayed guilt loop, nothing ends. It's just waiting. Rejection, echo rejection, enchantment is the psychological trick of subtly instilling the idea that others have already rejected you or soon will, leading you to reject yourself in advance in conversations, relationships, or decisions before reality has the opportunity to manifest. It's not about saying they don't love you. It's about making rejection seem inevitable. This tactic starts with off-the-cuff comments, ambiguous observations, or false assumptions disguised as insight. They probably think you are too much. You know, people are talking. I'm just trying to protect you. This always happens. These words are never shouted. They are released silently, like poison in water. The manipulator doesn't present it as his opinion. He presents it as a reflection of what others believe. And there is the hook. Because the moment the victim believes that she is being silently rejected by others, by her friends, her partner, her family, her bosses, she begins to shrink in advance. She lowers her voice. She doubts her own emotions. They withdraw before closeness, success, or joy can take root. Not because of real rejection, but because they've been programmed to expect it. Over time, these echoes become internalized. The victim no longer needs the manipulator to tell it to her. She tells it to herself now. They're not going to like that. She should not say anything. It is probably already too late for me. The manipulator's job is done. They have built an echo chamber in which rejection never has to occur externally because the person rejects themselves before anyone else can. And the cruel genius of planting echoes of rejection is that it isolates. The victim stops looking for security, stops believing that support is real, and begins to confuse silence with judgment. She enters all the rooms already feeling rejected, haunted by whispers that no one else hears because those whispers were planted there carefully, silently, permanently. Mimicry with malice. Mimicry with malice is a psychological manipulation technique in which a person imitates your tone, your gestures, your language, or your emotional expressions, not to create a relationship, but to mock, belittle, or destabilize your self-esteem through subtle humiliation disguised as imitation. At first, it may seem like a joke, a mocking smile when copying your way of speaking, an exaggerated version of your gestures. An imitation of your emotional tone, repeated with a volume slightly too loud, too slow, or too dramatic. Really, they resonate with that sarcastic tone, imitating your sincerity as if it were a disguise that amuses them. They laugh, they shrug. Relax, I'm just kidding. But it doesn't seem like a joke. It looks like an exhibition. It is not the warmth of reflection that is used to create bonds. It is a calculated distortion. The manipulator uses your own gestures as weapons, showing them as broken mirrors. You start to feel self-conscious in your own body. You question your tone, your expressions, your reactions. Each gesture becomes a risk of being reproduced later with mockery. You stop being spontaneous. You start censoring yourself in real time. Over time, this tactic trains you to be insignificant. You laugh with less freedom. You speak with less confidence. You turn off your authenticity. Because when the core of your being, your peculiarities, your tone, your natural way of expressing yourself repeatedly becomes a joke, you begin to associate self-expression with shame. And the manipulator hides behind humor. It is not that deep. You are too sensitive. But it is that deep because malicious imitation does not only mock the surface, it erodes the identity underneath until the victim learns that the safest version of themselves is the quietest. Projection of spiritual bypass. The projection of spiritual bypass is the psychological trick of using language, ideals, or spiritual practices to shame someone and get them out of their pain. It invalidates their instincts and masks manipulation as enlightenment. It is not about healing. It is about control wrapped in holiness. This tactic does not scream. It flows. It sounds wise, elevated, unshakably calm. When the victim expresses anger, fear, pain, or limits, the manipulator does not respond with empathy, but with rejection disguised as virtue. You're still clinging to the ego. That is not very elevated on your part. True healing means letting it go. These phrases sound like advice, but they hit like a blade. The raw humanity of the victim is treated as a defect to be overcome, not as a reality to respect. And there is the hook, because the victim wants growth. She wants to be self-aware, compassionate, with her feet on the ground. So when her very real traumatic response is labeled as attachment, or her boundaries are renamed resistance, she begins to doubt herself. She swallows pain instead of expressing it. She confuses silence for maturity. They call their own voice ego and the manipulator's voice truth. Over time, the victim becomes spiritually mute. They repress anger under a guise of peace. They ignore warning signs in the name of surrender. They abandon themselves while congratulating themselves on letting go. But they are not letting go. They are being shamed for their humanity by someone who uses enlightenment as a weapon. The manipulator, meanwhile, remains above it all. They never raise their voice. They never get carried away by the low-vibration emotions they provoke. They seem calm because they are in control. The chaos they cause does not affect them. It silences only the one who suffers. And the result is a person who believes that their suffering is spiritual failure, who believes that healing means submission, and who prays for peace while bleeding in silence in the name of alignment. The trap of inflating insecurity. The trap of insecurity inflation is a psychological manipulation tactic in which small doubts and defects, real or imagined, are carefully highlighted, amplified, and repeated until the person to whom it is directed perceives them as enormous, unbearable, and defining of their identity. It does not begin with insults. It begins with observations. You get overwhelmed easily, right? You have always been a bit anxious in crowds. I know you're not really the confident type. These comments seem casual, almost compassionate, but they name something fragile, something the victim may already fear in silence. Then they repeat it repeatedly. What was once a passing concern becomes a label, a personality trait, a barrier. The manipulator makes it part of the narrative. You are not like that. You do not handle stress well, or that is too much pressure for someone like you. And the victim, upon hearing this reflection repeatedly, begins to accept it. She stops questioning if it is true. She simply starts living as if it were. That is how the trap works. The more insecurity is inflated, the more power the manipulator gains. Because now the victim is locked into a version of herself that she does not fully agree with but feels too small to challenge. She begins to give up opportunities, to remain silent, to reject joy. Not because she lacks capacity, but because she has been conditioned to believe she is the problem. Over time, this creates a vicious circle of self-limitation. The victim acts according to her insecurity, which reinforces it and deepens that belief. And the manipulator has never had to control by force. He only had to name the wound, press on it, see how it swelled, and convince the person that that was what it had always been. Induction of mental confusion. The induction of mental confusion is the psychological trick of subtly overwhelming, distracting, or confusing someone deliberately until they begin to doubt their own thoughts, forget their original intentions, and lose their ability to think clearly in the presence of the manipulator. It is not about shouting or lying. It is about clouding cognition until control is perceived as clarity. This tactic unfolds like smoke, slow, invisible, and suffocating. The manipulator floods conversations with contradictions, digressions, vague answers, or endless context that revolve around the topic without ever addressing it. He may change the subject mid-sentence, over-explain simple ideas, or pepper statements with distortions so subtle that the victim feels the need to constantly reorient herself. It is not what I meant to say. But also, you have misinterpreted it. You are exaggerating. But yes, it happened. But not like that. Over time, the victim begins to feel mentally unstable, exhausted from trying to follow the thread of changing truths, emotionally drained from constantly recalibrating reality. The presence of the manipulator becomes a place where thoughts do not fix, logic slides, and memory becomes confused. The victim begins to apologize just to end the conversation. She withdraws inward, not out of shyness, but because her mind no longer feels safe in dialogue. And this is where the trick is reinforced. The manipulator offers themselves as the solution. I know it's a lot. I'm the only one who understands it. Let me explain it to you. It is too complicated for most people. They create confusion and then present themselves as the clearest voice within it. This generates dependence. The victim lost in the fog begins to trust the one who created it. The induction of mental fog does not silence by force. It silences by fatigue. It does not imprison with walls. It erodes the compass. And, finally, the victim stops arguing, stops thinking, and begins to ask for directions from the same hand that has created the fog in her mind. The trap of semantic overload. The trap of semantic overload is a psychological manipulation technique in which a person floods conversations with abstract language, technical jargon, or phrases loaded with emotion, creating confusion, imbalance, and doubt in the victim, so that she does not agree, but is indecisive because she no longer understands what is being said. It doesn't sound like manipulation. It sounds intelligent, sophisticated, illustrated. The manipulator speaks in circles that seem too dense to interrupt. He uses complex metaphors, philosophical digressions, excessively explained logic, or pseudo-therapeutic language that gets tangled in itself until the original point is lost. It is not that I am avoiding the subject. It is that the subject itself is a construction based on emotional projection. You are reacting from a traumatic perspective that distorts the present moment. What does that mean? You're not sure, but somehow you feel that you are the one who is wrong. And that is the goal. The semantic overload trap is not intended to clarify. Its goal is to destabilize. It is a torrent of language that drowns your instinct. It forces you to doubt your intuition and question your perception of reality. You start to think, maybe I don't understand it. Maybe I am too emotional. Maybe they operate on a level that I am not prepared for. The conversation becomes a scenario in which the manipulator wins by appearing too complex to be questioned. In the end, you stop resisting, not because they have convinced you, but because they have disoriented you. The manipulator's mastery of language becomes a smokescreen, and behind it, he builds a throne. You become quiet, cautious, insecure. They become the authority, not because they have the truth, but because they have made you feel that the truth is too complicated for you. That is the cruelty of the semantic overload trap. It does not silence your voice with fear. It silences it with fog until the easiest path is to surrender. Not reason, but the illusion of it. The denial of perception. The denial of perception is the psychological trick of rejecting someone's direct experience of reality, not with evidence, but with conviction, until they begin to question not only what they have seen or heard, but whether their senses and their intuition can be reliable again. It is not about proving that someone is wrong. It is about erasing the reliability of their mind. This tactic often seems calm, reasonable, even loving. The manipulator does not shout, "You are crazy." He says softly, "I don't think that happened as you remember it. You always take things badly. You're being too sensitive. It wasn't like that." They offer alternative versions of events that are not based on facts, but on a subtle authority, and they say it with such certainty that the victim begins to waver. The first time, the target may resist. "No, I remember what you said." But when the denial is repeated enough with the right tone of disappointment or confusion, the victim begins to rewrite their memory. "Maybe I was tired. Maybe I'm misunderstood. Maybe I exaggerated. They begin to doubt the only thing that no one should doubt, their own perception. Over time, this destabilizes their inner compass. They begin to turn to the manipulator for clarity, consulting them before trusting their feelings, waiting for external validation before reacting. This dependence grows until they stop expressing their concerns completely. Why talk if they're just going to deny you? Why trust your senses if they keep betraying you? And therein lies the genius of the denial of perception. It doesn't just change the narrative. It hijacks the lens through which narratives form. The manipulator does not have to control every moment. He only has to control the person's trust in their own eyes, their own ears, their own instinct. Once that disappears, the victim not only loses the arguments, they lose reality.